You can start now.
Good morning, good day, good afternoon for everybody. Welcome to the International Conference on Architecture between Autonomy and Engagement. The International Conferences on Architectural Criticism are being held every year since 2021. Its creation was proposed by Professor Wilfried WANG, and they have been organized with the participation of many members of the International Committee of Architectural Critics, SICA. SICA brings together critics, theorists, and historians from all over the world. The members of SICA share the conviction that criticism and the theoretical discourse of architecture are integral parts of the architectural process. SICA and its members aim to work alongside architects and other professionals towards a better architecture and better cities. Following the international conferences on architectural criticism in 2021, on architectural quality in 2022, and on architecture as built criticism in 2023, this year's conference debates are on realized buildings that stand in autonomy and engagement debates. The conference is held online. It comprises 4 online sessions to allow the participation of people in every continent. Each session is opened by a lecture from a distinguished guest, followed by the presentation and debate of 4 papers per session. This year's call for papers received around 80 propositions from 3 continents. As it happened in the previous conferences, the lectures and the papers will be published in a book to be edited next year by Park Books from Switzerland. The sessions are being recorded and will be published online after the conference. In this year's conference, we have introduced a new feature. Due to the seniority of 2 of our distinguished guests, namely today's guest, Denise Scott-Brown from Philadelphia, and next Saturday's, Álvaro Cisa from Oporto, their testimonies on the theme of the autonomy and engagement have been recorded in exclusive videos and will be presented by the SICA colleagues that personally visited and interviewed them. In the following sessions, we will also receive other notable guests, architect Nzinga Mbup from Dakar and architects Rosanna Hu and Lyndon Neri from Shanghai. In the name of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank you all the scientific committee colleagues, all the participants, and most especially our very dedicated support team. Now I give the floor to Professor Wilfried WANG for opening remarks, and thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you, Ruth, very much for your organization together with Carlos, Eduardo, Comas. You have been a great team, and the burden has mainly fallen on your shoulders, Ruth, as I understand. And you understand now the extent of an organization and an energy that is required to put together something like this. So thank you. And I would also like to thank all the members of the scientific committee who've been helping in the past 4 years, as well as this one, to select the papers for the conference, and also who have been advising us on which topics to pursue over the course of the last few years. And as it looks, we will have another at least 2 years of these annual conferences. So I welcome all the members of the audience, and I welcome all the members of the scientific committee to this event. I'm very grateful that you're participating. The idea behind this conference is very simple. We want to combine senior experience, if you like, with up-and-coming experts. And it's a platform to allow interchange of ideas, to allow critical discourse, and to allow discussion. And I think this is a very important event for especially the younger generations to challenge themselves to submit papers for admission into this conference. And I think it's an important career step to be included not only in the conference, but also in the book, something that I believe is still highly valuable, even in the age of websites and the internet. So having said this, I would like to introduce the two chairs of this session today. The first one is Carlos Eduardo Comas, who is an emeritus professor from the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul from Porto Alegre. He studied there and also at UPenn in Philadelphia. He's the leading expert on, certainly on Brazil, also on Latin America, and was involved in numerous publications, including the monograph on Lina Bombardi, as well as critical essays on Oscar Niemeyer. He, and together with Pancho Leonor and Patricio del Real, were the experts who informed the Museum of Modern Art on their exhibition on Latin America constructs. And I think it's a tribute to that group of researchers that such a tremendous piece of research was actually able to be shown, and rather belatedly in the United States. But there we are. It always takes some time for the North to realize what's happening in the South. Carlos will explain the idea behind the interview with Denise Scott-Brown. So I won't delve into that. I will introduce ELIAS Constantopoulos, who is an architect and designer, but most importantly, he's the president of the Hellenic Architecture Institute and has been vice president of the Hellenic Institute of Aesthetics for a number of years. He's a distinguished writer and critic, and a member of SICAM and a member of the scientific committee, as is Carlos Eduardo Comas. So these two colleagues have been mainstays in the work of the committee. So with that introduction, I should also say Elias and I started together in London, so we've known each other for decades. I'm very happy that he has participated in this, and I now give the floor to Carlos.
Are you seeing it? Are you seeing it?
Yes. Not yet, Comas.
Okay, I'll have to share again.
Yes, please.
Come on, it's not working.
It's opening.
It's open. Okay, is it working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Wilfried, for your words. I'll just want to add that Barry Bergdahl was the mastermind behind the MoMA show on Latin America, and I'll go straight to the point. I first saw Denise Scott-Brown while a student at Penn. She sat on the board of her neighborhood association, and this neighborhood was the subject of my urban design studio. I was impressed. In 2021, she signed a petition I wrote to save the Ministry of Education from being sold by the government. In 2023, I signed a petition she wrote to save the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London from mutilation. When Wilfried suggested a conference on architecture between autonomy and engagement, I immediately thought that the Sainsbury wing would be a particularly appropriate case study and that its surviving architect deserved a tribute. After an exchange of emails and a Zoom meeting, I visited her last February with a copy of a new book on her career. I got an autograph and the title for this presentation.
Welcome.
Well, Denise was not as effusive as when recording for Arquitetura Zentrum Wien in 2018, but she was no less warm. A 92-year-old lady in great shape, her face framed by silken beads, an Apple Watch in her wrist. Her well-lit and proportionate living room is cozy, maximalist, eclectic too. Batman pillows on the flame-stitch upholstery of the camelback sofa after a 17th century Chippendale model, a Hello Kitty doll sharing the tabletop with Gaia Lentis, Pipistrello lamp for Olivetti, the apple of the 60s and 70s in design style, and near the doll, a model of the flattened plywood chair that she and Robert Venturi designed for Knoll in '84. Denise's contribution to architecture, urbanism, and interior design has been huge as practitioner, curator, teacher, researcher, theoretician, critic, author. Most of her work was done in collaboration with Venturi, her partner in business and life, and I will call him Bob from now on. Most data on them can be found in the internet. The slide shows the couple in the Las Vegas Strip around 64. Sika won't commit the mistake the Pritzker Prize jury made in 1991 when the award went to Bob alone. As Denise has written, he said, 1 + 1 is greater than 2. Husband clearly agreed. And last, you will notice during this loosely chronological description, I have used it more and more the first person plural, that is we, meaning Denise and I. All my experience representing appreciation, support, and learning from would have less than half as reach without my partnership with my fellow artist, Denise Scott Brown. There would be significantly less dimension within the scope and quality of the work this award is acknowledging today, including dimensions theoretical, philosophical, and perceptive, especially social and urban, pertaining to the vernacular Thomas culture, from decorative to regional design, and in the quality of our design where Denise's input, creative and critical, is crucial. This is the acceptance speech. Pritzker speech from Venturi. Denise is curious. She asked architects to step out of an elite bubble and engage with reality, approaching mass society and culture in a non-judgmental way as scientists instead of preachers, artists instead of snobs. In a 64 book she probably didn't read, Italian Umberto Eco characterizes apocalyptic and integrated intellectuals. Denise is known. She saw transactions between highbrow and lowbrow cultures going both ways throughout history and was eager to know her context in depth to better transform it. She saw function as encompassing an operational and a symbolic dimension. As Eco shows in a later book, 68, conveying function in culturally codified terms is a prerequisite for using architecture. Denise has learned from everything and everybody, from native and colonial vernacular in South Africa to Cockney East London, from Venice and Rome to Philadelphia and then Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Levittown, even urban renewal as seen by sociologists like Herbert Gans, planners like Paul Davidoff, architects like Louis Kahn, but also from the history of Western architecture, classicism as taught by John Summerson, the Beaux-Arts tradition as explained by Donald Drew Egbert, from colleagues like Ellison and Peter Smithson, for whom Mies is great, but Corb communicates, to Bob's Holy Trinity, Edwin Lutyens, Le Corbusier, Alvar Aalto, or neoclassical master John Soane. Pop art is a reference to. Robert Rauschenberg's work is echoed in the photo Denise took from South Street near the Italian market where Venturi Sr. was a successful fruit merchant. The Queen Anne chair is an original at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The couple in the balcony of the Vanna Venturi house, where they briefly lived after their marriage in '67. Their courtship coincided with the preparation and launch of Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. Kindred souls, they defended architecture is not only service, but also art, enjoying a degree of disciplinary autonomy. Form follows previous forms too. Rule breakers, they knew that to break rules, they must first be understood. Champions of a mannerist, iconographically renovated modernism, they privileged flatness over muscularity, decorated sheds over docks in a postmodern condition. Denise speaks about their education on mannerism.
John Summerson's history course at the AA, 2 years running. I just sat through the whole thing. No exams, nothing like that. You just listened. And I listened twice. And I was this redhead South African who sat right at the front and asked him questions. And so I knew an awful lot about mannerism. And Bob knew nothing.
She's witty. Summerson was the longtime director of the Soane Museum, so receiving the Soane Medal 2018 was doubly meaningful for Denise. Moreover, her pre-recorded lecture was delivered at the Sainsbury Wing. The managed three-piece suit, button-down shirt and tie testified to her ironic sense of humor, obviously alluding to the Pritzker Prize jury's misogyny. Wit also surfaced in the Sainsbury Wing's earliest relative, designed for the American Independence Bicentennial, in which ghost-like frames, reminiscent of Alberto Giacometti's sculptures, represented founding father Benjamin Franklin's demolished print shop and mansion, his next to last abode. Franklin Court is entered through a carriageway under reconstructed 18th century townhouses. The steel frames delineate the contours of the print shop and mansion, whose original plans were lost. The area around the mansion became a colonial park that simulates the blocks of the nearby Society Hill neighborhood, with formal gardens across the front and an informal garden at the rear. Concrete hoods allow visitors to see the archaeological remains. A new brick structure shelters the ramps leading to the underground exhibition galleries and auditorium. Materiality contrasts define a temporal patchwork that is both subdued and forcefully engaged with the city and its history. Another relative is the addition to the Art Museum of the Oberlin College, an indented L-shaped composition of two international style boxes, the exhibition room set back from the Neoclassical Museum by Cass Gilbert, the assorted facilities set back from the exhibition room. The temporal patchwork is emphatically dissonant. The juxtaposition of the exhibition room and the museum is abrupt and accentuates their autonomy. Engagement here rhymes with conflict. But the checkerboard pattern of the exhibition room can be related to the paneling of the old facade, implying a progression from relief to flatness. I love the fat wooden column. Bold. Denise entered Venturi and Route 67. John Rout was the managing partner. Denise became a partner in 1969. The firm was renamed Venturi, Rout and Scott Brown, 1980. The photo, 1984, the year an open competition for the National Gallery extension ended in fiasco. 1 year later, an invite-on-only competition was announced after a donation by the Sainsbury's supermarket kings. Denise decided to act and call the National Gallery people.
I decided that these people hadn't heard of us. And they may have heard of us, but they didn't know we were doing museums. I decided that
it worked. The RSB was invited. The National Gallery is the long 1830s building by William Wilkins in central London, facing the north side of Trafalgar Square. Between the St. Martin in the Fields Church at the northeast corner and the site once occupied by the Hampton store bombed during World War II to the northwest. Leicester Square, where the theaters are, is linked to Trafalgar Square by Jubilee Walk between the National Gallery and the Hampton site. The Hampton site is then a whole block whose southern boundary faces East Pall Mall. The competition earlier mentioned involved teams of architects and developers. The brief was mixed, involving new exhibition galleries for the National Gallery and privately owned and managed office space. 6 entries were shortlisted out of 79. Rogers did the scheme people liked and disliked the most. ABK was favored by the specialist jury and selected for development. ABK provided an interesting central void. Rogers' high-tech scheme featured a tower, counterpointing St. Martin's spire and the Nelson column at the center of the square. Prince Charles hated all proposals and was vocal about it. Denise does not avoid sarcasm when pointing out the limited autonomy of architects in face of power.
So I've been reading in the architectural press of England this long debate. I think there were something like 74 different competition entries. And at one point, I think Skidmore, Owens and Merrill won a competition. Many other people made entries. Irons, Burton, Caralt produced a winning competition, and it was in design. And we gathered from the press that there were still lots of questions about it, and the curators, in a way that we got familiar with later ourselves, said, well, we agree with your basic access pattern, but we really need to do this, and could you do that? And could you please take away your circulation from the edge and put it in the middle? You can leave one on the edge as well. So now they had 2 circulation systems for 1.5 buildings, you could say. And one way and another, they said, would you do such and such? And the architect said, yes, sir, because you must serve the client, mustn't you? So you say, yes, sir, and you do what it takes to do. And then eventually they said, we need a coffee shop, and could you please put it at the top of a very tall tower over the building? And they said, yes, sir. Steel and glass coffee shop, a tall tower. Then Prince Charles looked at that and said, it looks like a carbuncle on the face of a beloved friend. And the same client, I believe, who asked them to do all that, fired them.
Denise meets the gallery's keeper and his assistant and makes her pitch.
So I had tea with these 2 gentlemen and talked to them about America and England and about architecture and about Sir John Soane, whom we loved, and about the fact that we were doing another museum, and showed them something of that. And they said, we didn't know you did museums. And at one point they said, what would you do? And I said, well, without having faced it, I think we would probably maintain the cornice height that exists on Trafalgar Square, and we'd probably use Portland stone, which is the famous London stone, and
Of the existing building.
of the existing and of much of London. It's a limestone. And they said, would you use classical columns? And I said, they said, no, they didn't say that. They said, would you do a classical building? And I said, I don't think so. And they said, well, why not? And I said, well, because we've never done one. And they said, something about the rhythm of the pilasters would be important to us. And it was quite prescient to have done all that.
The pitch succeeds in VRSB ZEIN. The new brief asks for, quotes, a more or less traditional solution that would fit in with Trafalgar Square. The galleries should consist of rooms having a substantial character, an air of permanence, and a sense of formality, tranquility, and harmony appropriate to Italian and North European early Renaissance paintings. Bob and Denise's three main concepts are: one, the galleries at the level of the existing building Piano Nobile; two, the stairs connecting the galleries and the ground floor; three, the facades. Sohn was an explicit reference for the design of the top-lit galleries. Both straight and false perspectives would enliven a church-like nave and side chapels layout. Laterally lit grand stairs appeared in a contemporary VRSB project, the Seattle Art Museum. Running alongside the walk between the National Gallery and its extension, these stairs would bring the old into the new by allowing views from the new to the old, from the old to the new, sorry. The whole site would be occupied, but the wing would be chamfered to engage with Trafalgar Square and Jubilee Walk. The Oberlin College edition emphasized contrast between new and old, tempered by a degree of assimilation, showcasing both engagement and autonomy of the new exhibition room regarding the old museum. Yet, from another viewpoint, the composition appears tripartite. The white painted box accommodating the facilities defines a progression instead of a simple juxtaposition, and the progression runs not only from relief to flatness, but also from blank enclosure to transparent openness, intricate to plain. A mix of contrast and assimilation would characterize the extension regarding the Wilkins building. The sketch speaks clearly. The stairs window opens a break that points out matching cornice lines and turns the bulk of the facades into a folding screen, if not a billboard. The pilasters ridging the screen oppose jazzy rhythms to elder regularity, their contraction followed by progressive release. Cutouts provide wide doorways, their horizontality balancing the tall stairs window and the niches above. Particularly striking, the corner cutout implies a cantilever and the frame structure that makes it possible. Statements of engagement and autonomy multiply, and let's listen to Bob and Denise.
There are a lot of ways we can talk about how we approached it. But essentially on the outside, the facade is somewhat, well, it's very important to look at the context. And the main aspects of the context are, it's in Trafalgar Square, so it's a building which is helping form the exterior square or place in central London. I mean, it's the biggest square in London. Then also it does connect with an important building, which is the National Gallery of Art, which is a symmetrical building, classical building of the 1830s. So we're doing two main things when we're designing that building from the standpoint of the front and from the standpoint of the outside. One was that it was to be a continuation of the existing building, although not a copy of it. And then the other was that it was to be a building that helped that acknowledged its position on the piazza, on the square, and helped the quality and enhance the quality of the square. And so essentially what we did when we analyzed the existing National Gallery building, it's a building that has a classical vocabulary and that its main aesthetic element is that of rhythm, that the vertical columns and pilasters on the building make for a kind of complex rhythm that's a little different in the front and then extends beyond and varies as it goes, but it's generally pretty consistent. So the rhythm of our building is such that we actually copied, which horrified modernists. We actually, on this one facade, not on the rest of the building, we copied the vocabulary, the elements of the 1830s building, but we made the pilasters not have an even rhythm, but a rhythm which was uneven and which inflected toward the building next to it. So therefore, it was a building separate from the other building by a space, but also inflecting toward the other building. So it's saying we are part of the older building. We're not just an addition, we are a continuation of it. So this varied rhythm, which is sort of jazzy, but sort of a jazz rhythm, as opposed to the rhythm of the old building, which is sort of correct rhythm of maybe you find a cravat or a minuet. Then we had to have a very big entrance at the bottom to accommodate anticipated 4 million. I think it's more than 4 million now, where the other building was built originally for a few thousand gentlemen a year. And so it's like the old building, but it has this huge zoom entrance in it, which is contradictory to the classical requirements, and which has this indirect rhythm. And then when you look from the side, you see the side of the building along that narrow space between the new and the old building. It is essentially a Mies van der Rohe modern building with lots of glass and steel construction. And then when you go in the back, it's different too. So the building that is facade all accommodate context. And then when you go in, that's another whole story. But essentially the outside of that. So,
the rhythm of the columns, and it isn't really classical. It's more like a billboard referring to a classical building. But all of that came out, and we did accept the basic plan of the one that they had approved, which is basically Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill's plan. It brought an L-shaped corridor from the existing building across Jubilee Walk and straight down the middle. And then Bob solved something that I didn't see anyone else ever solving and made the whole thing work, which is you had to take the entrance right at the corner of Trafalgar Square. It was the only logical place for the entrance, but everyone had to end up together, coming from the main building and coming from this new entrance on the second floor, what we say the second floor, what the English would say the first floor, just outside gallery number 9 and across Jubilee Walk, where he produced a very big stairway that led you up there slowly past another mezzanine floor as well, and it took you down into the basement, 2 levels too. So he had the stairway linking everything in a very understandable way, and brought you in at the top floor to the new experience of the some of the most precious paintings in the world and in that gallery, which are in the Sainsbury Wing. The rhythm of the color.
Compare Venturi and Scott Brown proposal oh, sorry, to Sterling, the strongest rival. What a difference a stair makes. Auditory and temporary exhibitions in the basement, bookshop at the ground floor. Restaurant at the mezzanine, the galleries at the top floor. Sections. Denise compared the section to a double-decker. The completed building in its setting. Aerial view, the chamfer facing the square, the pilasters and the lone column borrowed from the Wilkins building, as Bob said. Dark glass to excite curiosity, together with planar back painted gates, which are deliberately graceless, contrasting with the classical orders and belied by the clearly contemporary cuts and the folding screen or billboard. Like nature of the stone wall beside the window wall on Jubilee Walk. In U-boat studio, coming from Pall Mall, building becomes planar according to distance from the square, the other corner of Pall Mall. Loading docks, Pall Mall in the background, right. Brick surfaces, enclosed service areas. Back facade given onto a larger sector of Jubilee Walk, a piazzetta, Wilkins to the left, and this is a Google Earth photo, no makeup, the walk to the back. Let's get in. The entrance hall, information desk, follows the corridor for the elevators and the temporary exhibition galleries downstairs. Stairs going down to the temporary exhibition galleries, back in the hall, going up in style, industrial notes. We've made it. Going back, entrance hall. Bob and Denise would have said they wanted a crypt-like, somber.
So the building is easily misunderstood. I think a lot of people did love it. We have copies of good quotes and negative quotes from the writers. And the negative quotes are wonderful because of vulgar American blah blah all that. And then there are other quotes that are very nice. But it is essentially a building where the pure modernists said, "Oh, it's not modern because it has adapted the classical elements." And then the modernists said. Then the classicists said, "Hey, it's not correctly historical because it has this jazzy rhythm instead of a correct classical rhythm." Then the inside is another story, which is interesting. But it is so nice that the client liked it, and in general, the family of the Graners, who gave all the money, a lot of money, more or less went along with it. We had some problems with dealing with the client involving some details, but in general, in the end, it turned out.
Sadly, the petition I mentioned at the beginning did not save Sainsbury Wing. The lighting is called Annabella Serdolf Architects, and it struck twice. The first time the blow was on the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, La Jolla, institution that grew around the Scripps House by Irving Gill in 1916. The whimsical colonnade was added by VRSB as part of their additions, renovation, and restoration in 1986-96. The entrance pergola with the small lettering was part of their engagement with Gill's Women's Club opposite. Annabelle Seldorf 2022 removed 8 reasons entrance was confusing. So Seldorf adds a new entrance, very bland, at the corner. She breaks the continuity of the facade plane that answered to the institutional character acquired by the former house, annihilating the engagement of the museum with its context. That it's not, this is a recent photograph, but it's not difficult to imagine the museum with the pergola and conclude that its removal was unnecessary and detrimental to the plastic wellness of the area, not to say the museum itself. 2023, the National Gallery Board decided to turn the Sainsbury wing into the main entrance to the premise. The existing entrance hall was deemed gloomy, confusing, unfriendly, forbidding. So gone the gates, the dark glass, the crypt-like character of the entrance hall, part of an expertly choreographed progression. This is the rendering by Seldorf architects, and you can see the distinction between the dark glass of the existing Sainsbury wing and the replacement by white clear glass. Changes included cutting part of the mezzanine and cleaning the columns, despite protests and the fact that the building is Grade 1 listed and received a 25-year award from the American Institute of Architects. The operations are underway. As someone said, the space will sport the allure of an airport lounge. The sense of mystery, exciting curiosity will be gone. Denise speaks.
What that stairway does is it modulates your eye. We made black glass, and we went to see 6 or 7 different kinds of black glass before we chose. And then as you walked up, it got darker. The way, if you go into a church, you go into a tight little space which is dark. You come to the church, you say, oh, those rose windows are so bright, because your eyes have been modulated. We modulated people's eyes that way. That's why they thought the paintings had been washed. But the paintings weren't washed.
Yet Denise keeps her weight. I end with an appropriation. Denise's speech for the downtown Denise Scott Brown exhibition at the Architecture Zentrum DENISE.
My experiences in Africa and then in England with the social unrest in both places, and then coming to a very quiet America that soon blew up too, was tied in very much with the excitement of the practice we've had. And the social movements were only one thing that led us to Las Vegas, but they were very much part of the reasons we went there, as well as the pop art movement. And then taking those researchers, those trying to define for ourselves what the issues were in places like that, which was so exciting. When Bob played a game, he and I together, I can like something worse than you can like. It was a journey of fun discovery. It's gone on through our practice as well, the experience of working in many countries in the world, being on whispering terms with people shortly after you meet them and helping them achieve something very important to them, but mainly trying to understand the patterns we found ourselves in and react to them and bring out of them, as well as what we could offer them, something special. And I wish you all that wonderful experience. It involves opening the window of architecture wider and looking onto a broader world than the ones we have been trained to do.
Well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Comas. Would you please stop the sharing?
Yeah.
We still have some time before the interval. So if anyone would like to make any question or any comment on this presentation, I believe we have kind of 10 minutes for that.
May I ask something, Professor Comas?
Yes, Elias.
Hello, Carlos. I recently read that while taking down the columns, they discovered a note by Lord Sainsbury in them.
Yes.
Who really did not like them, and they feel that he was vindicated that the columns were taken down. Do you know anything about the story to tell us something about it?
Well, haven't you heard Venturi saying that they had some problems with the clients?
Yes, I noticed.
That's part of it. Actually, there was a discussion over the Corinthian column, and there was also and the Corinthian column was kept because Neil MacGregor, that was the director of the National Gallery at that time, went with it. But Venturi, Bob and Denise lost another dear detail to them that would be to have a window at the end of the main gallery axis. It seems that the window is there, but it's covered. So it wasn't really easy, and it's a very complex brief, and a tight site. But in the end, I think that they got, Bob and Denise got the essential, being accepted and built up.
Yes, Wilfried.
Thank you, Carlos. I think you did a very sympathetic reading of the work of Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown, and I think certainly focusing on the key issues of their work, as well as particularly the Sainsbury wing. I think it still is a project that tests many people's nerves.
Yeah.
Because the question still remains, do you side with the modernists? Do you side with the postmodernists? Where do you see yourself? And for those people who were actually actively engaged in various competitions in those years, Elias and I were in London at the time, so the controversy was part of our education. It was a fascinating education, you could say, and in hindsight, having read Complexity and Contradictions in architecture very early, it was a very difficult piece of literature for many students. I found it fascinating, and it opened a view, as Denise Scott said right at the end, it opened the window to a world of possibilities. I think in hindsight, one has to acknowledge certain strengths of the design in the way that the Skidmore-Owings-Merrill idea of the kind of continuity was a logical thing to expect when you come from the piano nobile of the main gallery. and the key issue of how to connect between street level, the piazza level, and the main exhibition. So the awkward question of should you have a double height space? Should you have a single height crypt-like space? It isn't really a crypt-like space. One has to state that.
Is it like sorry,
it's not really a crypt-like space. It's like an undercroft of a department store, frankly. I think one can debate this, but the issue that caused concern and that led to this opening, I can understand very well. That was a kind of a deficiency felt by many users as well as the museum curators. So I think we could sort of maybe discuss this issue. To what extent is an intervention in a kind of listed building justifiable? Is the design that Anna Seldorf proposed a good one? Could there have been a better one? Could there be an architect with maybe a more sympathetic position closer to Venturi Scott Brown? Could a person or a practice have been chosen instead of Seldorf? I don't know, but we could sort of discuss this issue.
Well, I'm sure that in both cases, both in San Diego and in London, Seldorf Associates had many more things to do, and that they did it with competence. I do think that Sainsbury Wing. I don't remember quite well the entrance hall. It has been a while since I've been there, but I do tend to think that I do remember, the entrance hall at the Sainsbury Wing as kind of cluttered, but cluttered, by all the things the administration, put in there. So actually, it's a kind of interior design problem, I would say, more than anything else. Because in the end, both in the case of San Diego and in the case of the Sainsbury Wing, what we do have is a problem of taste. Annabelle Seldorf and Gabriele Finaldi, who is the present director of the Sainsbury Wing, they want it to be light, welcoming, but that's her idea. That's their idea. I'm perfectly okay with the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is sort of gloomy, and so it's a kind of aesthetic question. In this point, I don't think that one can come up with a rationale, for the situation. But in this case, and speaking about, preservation, I would stick, to the original scheme. In the case of the Sainsbury Wing, as this choreography of dark to light, even if it isn't a crypt, even if it's the undercroft of a department store, I think that you do tend to detract, from the richness, of the building when you blow up, the mystery. And also, I think that the change from black to clear glass, also in the exterior, is even more unfortunate, I'd say. But that's my opinion. That's my viewpoint, and it's relative.
Yes, please, Sengo.
Dear Carlos, I probably am the person who enjoyed your presentation very much because you reminded me of my youth. All these people, Venturi and Khan, were hosted by my university, University of Pennsylvania, and they both built on our campus as well. But the funny thing is that when I start the design phase of my design education, the project, I warn my students, I don't want postmodern, but if you design something like the Salisbury wing, I might accept. You see, I think, Wilfried, from the outside, looking from space towards the building, I think it's really successful. But with the interior criticism you made, I don't know much about it. Maybe you are right. I don't know. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. Let me correct something. Both Wilfried and you, Sengel, you talked about postmodernism, and it's usual to call Venturi and Denise postmodernists, but actually they refuse the label. And certainly I would say that it would be much more correct to, if labels are necessary, I do think that this is a mannerist modernism. And it's curious, we
Yes.
didn't have the time, to put up all the 6 entries. I only got 2 slides of Stirling's proposal in the table, and it's amazing how all the 6, including Kohun and Miller, they went for classical elements.
Yeah, I know. I know.
The bit about the limited autonomy of architects in face of power is really unavoidable, So in a way, Venturi is the most modern of the schemes, it's the most engaged, with the original flatness, of the of modern architecture. So you have to see the scheme in comparison with them, in comparison with the others, to get I think a fuller appreciation of what they did achieve and what they did not achieve. Anyway, I'd say that modern, which is really how they refer to themselves, and I think it's
correct.
Apt label, for what they've done. I would say that also I think that one of the problems is not only autonomy of engagement, but one of the problems that fits into the autonomy and engagement discussion has to do with figuration, abstraction. But that's what really is at stake in these, opposition, these modern on one side and postmodernism, and the other side. And if I think that it's quite revealing that the Holy Trinity in complexity and contradiction in architecture is Lutyens, but it's Lutyens that would be one for eclecticism, and academic, training, but then you have Le Corbusier and Alto. So actually, you have to read you have to read complexity and contradiction with the sense that, in a way, what Venturi is asking, as well architects, is look back to our own past. I think that this side of complexity and contradiction has been much diminished, by criticism of the book or appreciations of the book. So I think that Venturi is very, very sincere when he says he is opening up, things. And then I would say that what he's doing is they are doing is that they develop in a much fuller way what was really apparent, in literally in High Point, the High Point 1, and High Point 2, the Cariates in what's the name of the guy? Huh?
Tecton.
Tecton's building, or else, in our own Ministry of Education building, where the superstructure is made to look like a sheep, and everybody recognized that at the time, both the popular press and the architects. So,
Wilfried?
I would like to clarify the achievement of the Sainsbury wing, because I think one key issue is the complexity of the site. Number one, it's at the corner of Trafalgar Square. It's on an irregular site, which challenged many architects who tried to use orthogonal geometry. There is a gap between the volumes. There was a requirement to have an entrance there, and so how do you bring people from that level to the second level or the third level, as it were? And given all these things, the other architects tried the old traditional architecture, which is an architecture of integrity, where the syntax of the plan, the typology of the plan, the elements that construct the structural system and the constructional elements altogether were a coherent statement. So they actually were much more interested in the autonomy of their structure, whereas the Scott Brown, the Venturi Scott Brown version, is one where actually they use the collage technique to address different issues. So there's actually a kind of a relative autonomy of different components of the architecture to address different tasks. And in that sense, they break this tradition of a coherent architecture, a coherent autonomous architecture.
That's very Corbusian also, if you think about it. And it's also very academic. So the Beaux-Arts training of both Venturi and Scott Brown shows is the kind of adaptation that you would find in the plan of something like, for instance, the Hôtel de Beauvais. It's yeah, I agree with everything you said. Just adding to it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Comas, and all the participants. I have the unfortunate task of keeping the timing. So we are now, the discussion is very interesting, but we'll have another moment for discussion, debate in the end. We're going to do a very brief interval when the recording is stopped in order to ask our participants, the next participants, to test their presentations. So thank you very much. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Well, it depends the hour where you are, but in kind of less than 10 minutes. Thank you. Giovanna, please stop the recording for a while. Interrupt.
Yes.
So good evening.
Let's. Okay.
No, please, Ruth, go ahead.
No, I was just giving the floor to you, Elias. Please continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, again. I find it very interesting that we started today with this debate at the end with Carlos and Wilfried on the Sainsbury building, which we might resume at the end. It seems to still instigate a lot of discussion and passions about autonomy and engagement, so we'll see how it goes in the end. This first session is about autonomy, engagement, and heritage, and we have some very interesting discussions of buildings, especially in relation to their context. They're all illuminating very different approaches from China, the US, Italy, and Spain. So without further ado, I'll come to our first speaker in this session, Dr. Xiang Ren. He's an architect and academic. He teaches and researches in architectural history, theory, and design at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture and Landscape. At the university, he co-directs the East-West Studies in Architecture and Landscape, co-founded by Peter Blundell-Jones with Jan Boedstra in 1995. Ren's research was shortlisted twice in the RIBA President's Research Awards in 2014 and 2016, and secured prestigious research grants and awards from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Arcadia, British Academy, and the French Embassy in the UK. The topic of Xiang Ren's presentation will be about Westline Studio Shui Minority Cultural Center in Guizhou, China, southern province, and specifically on the elementary form of architecture for the ethnic minorities. Dr. Ren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Elias, for your introduction, and thank you very much for Professor Ruth and Professor Carlos for your organization of this fascinating conference, which I'm really have the great pleasure to join for the second time. And thank you for Professor WILFRIED to act as the mentor of my paper. So there has been a So there has been a pressing need for the discipline and profession of architecture to clarify its core disciplinary knowledge and to continue its uncompleted disciplinary project in the age of planetary crisis, environmentally, socially, and geopolitically. And I think to fulfill this needs requires a critical articulation of the long and increasing tension between architecture's inside, which is more referred to autonomy, and architecture's outside, which I more refer to engagement, arguably from the increasingly thinly spreaded architectural history theory criticism, more than design practice. So the tension and disjunction in the architectural production between the autonomous forms of practice on buildings and the wider architectural engagements of other forms, it's literally born out of architecture as both a discipline and a profession. And I think we need to recognize this uncomfortable gap, which is the vast gray territory, as a first step to move forward, that theoretical research and extended criticism on exemplar buildings and designs has to reestablish its relevance to the societies they serve by demonstrating vivid and valid arguments to their burning contemporary issues. So I believe this form of architectural criticism requires a thicker interpretation from both outside, for example, philosophical or anthropological fields, in order to respond to the rapidly inside problem, which is decaying and declining and dissolved architecture status intellectually and professionally. So the contemporary architecture of Shui Minority Culture Center, which you saw here, located in Sandu County of Guizhou province at the remote southwestern boundary of China, completed by Westline Studio in 2017. It is selected as a focus case study, not only because of its unique design proposition and matured operandi to navigate complex internal contexts and external conditions, but because of its physical presence and meaningful presentation of an elemental form which suggests an important capacity for architecture to transcend the opposing binaries of autonomy and engagement. So Westline Studio is a local architectural practice being based in Guizhou for more than 20 years, has been very quietly and consistently practicing architecture at its most peripheral, with the modus operandi informed by lateral topography, local craftsmanship, and aesthetic rituals, which you have seen this mosaic of their completed projects, and the number 11 is my case study today. And also was to mention that Guizhou is both an administrative Southwest Chinese province, but also a very stabilized and diversified regional cultural commune for centuries. Shui people, as one of the Aboriginal minority ethnic groups living in Guizhou with a surprisingly long history since around 7th century. They currently have a total population of around 500,000, with more than 60% living in the Sandu County where this project is located. And Shui vernacular talk about this image of the Shui cosmologist. You can see that is a hybrid of drawing and writing with those narrative forms depicting animals and other movements about the larger cosmological understanding of the earth and heaven. And the Shui vernacular architecture and settlements have been largely homogenized by rural urbanization all across China, although they do have historical villages like the picture on your left that you can see in the middle of the village in this circular semi-public circular public piazza that local people gather together and perform indigenous celebration rituals. But in general, the vernacular architecture of Shui has been gone, which we can arguably stating that, and it has been dragging into the waves of secular modernization and urbanization. So the greater problem that faces Shui society is the preservation of their sense of secret in their own belief systems and their own social structures. So the architecture design of Shui Minority Culture Center compared and engaged both the specificity of ceremonial rituals, drum display, dance, aesthetics, atmosphere, animal and plant patterns, layout and organization of gathering space, and so on and so forth. But there's also an approach to sound and spirit, texture and text, which constitute this indigenous Shui world making. Among them, there are about 400 characters survived from the ancient Shui text. This is a particular source in the engagement of architecture design of this building, that individual engagement to individual text is possible in order to translate what exactly it means and to understand the Shui ideas on cosmology, geography, ethics, and philosophy in these half-written and half-drawn forms. And there are also anthropological evidence showing that these 400 Shui texts are still powerful in functioning the Shui everyday life till now. For example, choosing a particular date for marriage or funeral. So engaging with this is the first step for the architecture practice, but it's hard because none of the architects of the practice happen to be Shui ethnic. There are other ethnics of the region, but also because of the mythical and the metaphysical autonomy in nature for this indigenous culture. So in other words, this particular Shui communities and culture, they need a symbolic form as a symbolic marker to move towards some sort of modernities in their own ways. That is the beginning of the architecture design. And you can see that in all the rich varieties of culture systems which have evolved throughout the Shui people's past and present in their life worlds, that the celebration of ancestors and nature, in particular mountain, has been the key, has been something shared in common, which means that Shui people has a very blurred boundary in understanding the ritual celebration in the outside, in between the mountains, and in the inside, which is sheltered by a roof. So there's not a very strong distinction between inside and outside in terms of Shui celebration and worship, and that is the beginning of this architecture idea for several major public building for this inward-looking indigenous community. So through extensive study and learning from this, but also working with the last few living generation of Shui text masters, who are those elderly who has knowledge in writing or preserving this tacit knowledge and passing down from generation to generations. There are a few living generation of Shui text masters. And Westline Studio produced a pure and powerful form with archetypal geometry, which is
You have turned the sound off.
Sorry, Xiang Ren, please activate your sound again. Something happened.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so through extensive study and learning from the last few living generation of Shui text masters, Westline Studio produced a pure and powerful form with archetypal geometry, which is self-referential and self-evidential for a specific site here. A specific site sandwiched by existing mountains and cut through by the only modern infrastructure, which you see from my mouse from north to the south. And this is a edge condition of the Shui villages. Although we can see two existing Shui compounds here, but actually driving from here, this needs another nearly half an hour drive into deepest Shui settlement. So this is the edge condition of the village, and it has been developed as part of the arrival zone into this indigenous community, partly and predominantly for tourism. And there's a debate on modern tourism's impact on this, because on one side, for the economic development for this disadvantaged location and deprivileged communities, tourism is needed. It's a much needed action for future. But on the other hand, we all know that irreversible side effects will come in hand to the indigenous communities while they open up to the new modern world. And in this process, the power, the authority, and the developer, they do use architecture as an instrumental tool for that, to develop this arrival zone for tourism, which is a specific side of the Minority Culture Center. However, there are ways to resist this. There are important beliefs that indigenous kinship societies and their belief systems are the most fragile and vulnerable, and to resist these dominant forces and forms from the outside. And they're also vulnerable to lose their fragile balance between internal autonomy and the external engagement. So this is the critical positioning and the start of the design for West 9 Studio, because there are two prevailing tendencies towards the design were consciously avoided by them. The first to avoid is the nostalgic return to a Shui historical imaginary, via selected elements through which confirmation or renegotiation of grand narratives built upon the biased ways of engaging and interpreting Shui indigenous as the other. The second to avoid is the rush introduction and blind imposing of a modern institution with little consideration of Shui's foundation as an indigenous group, which we have been seeing in many other contemporary architecture in the region for other minority ethnic groups. So West 9 Studio found the third way, which you see from this site layout plan, that it reaches a certain level of intensity by intensifying the use of indigenous references to create a strong resistance against the superficial scenes in secularized neoliberal state capitalist production of contemporary cities. And this resulted in the Shui Minority Center, which in this within this red line boundary that looks like an archipelago in the sea of the urbanization, if I can quote Pierre Victor Aureli. So a direct interpretation, a critical interpretation of the key term, the mountain and the rain, has been the driving force in developing the specific design language and vocabulary of this building. And enclosed by a ritual piazza involving a plain water pump, as you can see here, and a few limited tree as lecture metaphors. The building is organized by 3 primary halls in its plan layout for reception, exhibition, and ritual celebration. So this is the main entrance going into the main celebration hall, which unfolds the structures in parallel. And each hall is sheltered by a sharp triangle roof, which extends to the ground, and like you say here, and also the roof extends the building into the mountain to meet the mountain as part of that. And you can see also the entrance bridge cutting through the water pond, bringing guests into the central hall from here. And there's another corner entrance from the other side, which you see from the plan here. That is the main entrance cutting across the bridge. And there's another one coming upstairs and going into the upper floor. So spaces in between these 3 halls contain supporting facilities such as offices, storages, and washrooms. And there's a freestanding long ramp placed nearly the center of the axis of the ceremonial hall, providing a focal point of space while collecting to the external piazza and stairs. Upper floor plan here. The expression and persistence on the spatial potential of the irregular geometries, on the 8 perspective qualities of interior, on the making of the hall and linking one hall to another, exceeds beyond the limits of a reductive modernist open plan towards an organic whole. For Western Studio, the point of departure for this spatial layout and spatial organization is the Shui ritual tradition of ancestral and lateral worship. As I said, some happened in the middle of the lateral, sandwiched by the skies and with the space in between the mountains and looking at the sky as the roof, and some of them later being used in a shattered roof space, which is more interior. And it expresses the rawness and thicknesses of the in situ concrete constructions throughout the transition between the floors and the roof walls. So there's no distinction between the roof and the walls. And there are traces of human labor, of craftsmen's improvisations, of the happy accidents, of the local timber formworks. They're all very visible from the construction of the whole volume down to the elemental details such as the doorways, the window frames, the ramps, the handrails, and so on and so forth. The fundamental architecture elements, the wall, the roof, the hall, the threshold of the Shui Culture Center develops a very restrained but very expressive architecture. There's a sense of publicness, vast interiors, material tectonics, the visual depth, the sense of weight, and its collection to evoke the sense of primitive heart. And the geometry of the mountain and gesture of that the street pattern, all of this reconciled through these very qualitative aspects of architecture elements into texture and color. Yet the architecture elements only gain their deepest meaning through the perspective of those indigenous Shui people whose life world takes place there for generations after generations, but whose voices and ideas are usually unheard and unseen. And this is the ceremonial activity self-organized by the Shui indigenous group during the construction period, while it has not finished yet. And there's a ritual celebration happened in the piazza entrance of the site. To extend from Amaya Turgan, who wrote that milestone, the elemental form of religious life. And I think an elemental form of architecture in Shui Minority Culture Center should be contextualized and conceptualized from the architecture of the familiar form. So not architecture of the familiar form, but the architecture ring of the familiar form through a series of fundamental elements like the wall, the hall, the roof, the threshold, and their archetypal collection to the specific place and this indigenous group of people who inhabit it and imagine it. All these constitute an elemental form of architecture which negotiates its internal autonomy and external engagement in its simplest way, but with a bold statement. And in this way, I believe the fault line between the autonomy and the engagement might be overcome, leading towards a new agency for Shui people instead of an old reconciliation between the self and the other. Shui Minority Center expresses an architecture in its most elemental, which weaves the tectonic, the tactility, and the topography, in particular the mountain, in its own right as anchor, as mnemonic, as storyteller, at the same time expresses the fundamental human condition of this indigenous group with reference for their own internal autonomy, which express the agency of architecture constantly and continuously working and reworking on its own terrain, at the same time suggesting some strategic relative agencies for the future. Because this is, again, I would say, want to reinstate, this is the first ever public building for this inward-looking indigenous community, and they need a symbolic marker to mark their entrance or mark their meeting with the modern world. So it's the first one step further and burdened this architecture form and construction. Western Studio juxtaposes this specific architecture way which provokes the reinvention of architecture from within its own traditions and from within its given conditions of a specific site of the economic constraints and political administrative change, but more importantly, of the indigenous place as interpreted, in order to strike a balance, a fragile but delicate balance between the autonomy and engagement. And I'd like to even think a bit louder to place this specific project within the longitudinal discipline trajectory of architecture, and to think of a possibility to call for a thicker interpretation in architecture criticism, which is not only to shed intellectual light upon the interpretation of a specific building for a specific context, but rather to readdress an elemental form of architecture with sensitivities and sensibilities to those minor moments and for a specific minority group from a remote location. And that might provide a new common ground, which hold together architecture, history, theory, design, and criticism together. Because mostly history and theory has been seen more leaning to autonomy, and design and criticism were conventionally seen more leaning to the engagement. But I've seen from many masterpieces in the past century that there's a way to reassert its value as a way to bring the knowledge of architecture tradition to bear on contemporary realities, to quote from Bret Steele. The elemental form of this building, Shui Minority Culture Center, demonstrates again that architecture is a discipline, that it has a disciplinary form of knowledge, that there are ideas we can constantly learn from the past about how non-architects and indigenous groups have negotiated that knowledge and how that body of knowledge is still as valid today as they were a long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiang Ren, for keeping the time as well. If you can unshare, thank you for this very interesting attempt to bridge over, as you call it, this uncomfortable zone between autonomy and engagement, between fast-changing contemporary societies and this ontological reinterpretation of archetypical exemplary buildings. Next on our list is Izzy Kornblatt. Izzy Kornblatt is a critic and an architectural historian. He studied philosophy at Swarthmore College and design studies at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's a PhD student at the Yale School of Architecture. He has contributed to several books and publications and curated 2 exhibitions. He currently serves as a contributing editor at Architectural Record. In 2020, he co-founded Design Yard Sale, a fundraiser for racial justice that sold and auctioned hundreds of artworks by designers around the world. Izzy Kornblatt's presentation will be about the very well-known Maya Lin Vietnam Veteran Memorial in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Izzy Kornblatt. Please share your PowerPoint with us. And you have 20 minutes.
Can everyone see the screen? All right, great. First of all, thank you so much for including me in this conference. It's wonderful to come together with a community of people interested in architecture criticism. And a special thank you to Robert McCarter for his extremely helpful and thoughtful comments on my paper. So this is entitled Architecture Against War, Rethinking Autonomy at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. debuted in 1982, not long after debates over the phantasmal ideal of autonomy consumed the academic echelons of architecture. Like the work of autonomy's most prominent proponents, Peter Eisenman and the so-called whites, the memorial is decidedly abstract and unsentimental, taking the form of a dark, geometric incision into the ground just off the National Mall. It refuses to cloak itself in the skin-deep neoclassicism that has become the signature language of American government. It has no axial approaches, no stylized columns, no suggestive ornamentation, no tectonic expression of masonry. Where most of the buildings on the mall rise above the landscape in a blindingly white show of national pride that nods to both to Versailles and to the ruins of antiquity, Linn's memorial pushes downward into the earth, black, hidden in shadow. Its formal precedents can be found in the avant-garde movements of the early 20th century, which sought the very same decisive break with tradition, albeit in different physical and historical contexts. Yet, perhaps in part because its designer was not a fixture of the theory circuit, Linn created the design for a class when she was a senior at Yale and then submitted it on a whim to the memorial competition in 1981. This memorial is rarely, if ever, mentioned in connection with theories of autonomy. This may also have something to do with its rather remarkable popularity. It has become a cultural touchstone, one of the most visited sites in Washington, and the only work that might be labeled modern to be selected among the top 10 most liked buildings in a 2007 survey of the public commissioned by the American Institute of Architects. Autonomous architecture, by contrast, tends not to know what to do with the affections of people outside the discipline. If the point is to delimit an independent realm of meaning, to separate architecture from the rest of the social and cultural world, one cannot try or expect to win over an uninitiated public. Gatekeeping is a not at all insubstantial part of the game. This is where Linn's memorial departs from straightforwardly autonomous work. It exhibits a certain geometric purism, yes, but its responsiveness to the ravages of war and the shifting culture of a post-1968 United States suggests it is far more interested in its social and political context than the internal formal languages of the discipline. Yet the memorial also betrays no trace of influence from the so-called Greys, who argued against the autonomy associated with the whites, figures like Charles Moore and Robert A.M. Stern, and in popular culture in the US, commentators like Tom Wolfe, who advanced pseudo-populist, tradition-focused arguments under the banner of engagement with a broad audience. The memorial doesn't posit its engagement with the world outside architecture as an antidote to an elitist, self-styled avant-garde. Rather, Linn's design refuses the autonomy engagement binary entirely. It rejects the very framing of the problem. In an essay first drafted in 1982, but not published until 2000, Linn described the thinking behind her design. "I imagine taking a knife and cutting into the earth," she wrote, "opening it up, an initial violence and pain that in time would heal. The grass would grow back, but the initial cut would remain a pure flat surface in the earth with a polished, mirrored surface, much like the surface on a geode when you cut it and polish the edge. The need for the names to be on the memorial would become the memorial. There was no need to embellish the design further. The people and their names would allow everyone to respond and remember. It would be an interface between our world and the quieter, darker, more peaceful world beyond." Linn's design takes the form of a pair of polished black granite surfaces set into the grass that meet at an oblique angle. At their outer edges, the granite slabs rise just barely out of the ground, but as the landscape slopes slowly downward from either side, reaching its lowest point at the vertex, the slabs grow in height relative to the visitor, rising to a peak of 10 feet. Located in the lush Constitution Gardens, just a few hundred feet from the Abraham Lincoln Memorial, this memorial is nearly invisible from behind, where the ground remains flat. It has little mass of its own. At just a few inches in depth, the granite surfaces appear less as walls than as membranes holding back the weight of the land. Linn recalled insisting to the architect of record that the granite needed to be as thin as possible. As she had first imagined, the walls are filled with the tens of thousands of names of American military service members who died or went missing in the Vietnam War. A pathway running next to the granite allows visitors to slowly descend over the course of some 250 feet as the columns of names grow taller and taller, and then ascend again over the course of another 250 feet as the columns shorten and the National Mall comes back into view. The names of the dead are engraved in small type, a pragmatic decision in that it enables all 58,000 to be included, but also a striking one in its bucking of the conventions of memorials. For the visitor, the effect is intense, bordering on the overwhelming sense of reverence and dread that for Edmund Burke characterized the notion of the sublime. The sheer number of names, the sheer scale of death, engulf you as the granite panels grow ever taller. When they reach your own height, you notice your shadowy reflection staring back at you between the endless rows of names. No narrative of the war is presented. This memorial has no beginning and no end. The names appear chronologically, both starting and ending at the center, as if playing in an enormous loop. This space and its visitors' contributions to it, the flowers and photographs that families so often lay near the names of their loved ones, are affecting. But the space does not leave you feeling uplifted or on the right side of history. It makes no attempt to gloss over the brutality of war. If the memorial seems to bear little relation to the theoretical debates then raging within architecture, it does deliberately respond to the modern history of memorialization and that of the conceptions of trauma. Jan Scruggs, the veteran who founded and led the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, from the beginning conceived of the project through the lens of the psychological discourse on PTSD that emerged around Vietnam veterans. In his 2009 book, The Vietnam War in American Memory, Patrick Hagopian recounts how the popular image of Scruggs as naive and idealistic belied the reality that he had completed a master's degree in counseling and published well-regarded research on the psychological struggles faced by returning veterans. Like many others of his time, Scruggs believed that the politicization, ignominy, and ultimate loss of the war had led already traumatized veterans to further suffer upon returning home to a nation ashamed of their service. This was a compelling view, but also a dangerous one. For by casting American soldiers as sufferers of a psychological disorder, PTSD, it minimized their responsibility for the series of atrocities committed by Americans during the war. It created an equivalence between victim and perpetrator, with the latter's unconscionable acts seen as symptoms of a previously undiagnosed pathology. It comes as no surprise, then, that the program for a national memorial that Scruggs crafted ignored the abuses committed by American soldiers entirely. Scruggs' aim, rather, was to acknowledge and remedy the continuing suffering of veterans, less by providing the victory parades and hero status afforded veterans of earlier wars, as he put it, than by, quote, reminding an ungrateful nation of what it has done to its sons. This framing also carried the benefit of being at least nominally apolitical. By emphasizing the needs of veterans rather than seeking to valorize or condemn the war in which they served, Scruggs managed to appeal for support across the political spectrum. This also led Scruggs and his colleagues to include in their competition brief a striking requirement that the memorial include the name of every single veteran killed in the war. Linn saw her competition submission in similar terms. I felt that the politics had eclipsed the veterans, their service, and their lives, she wrote, describing her desire for the memorial to be experiential and cathartic, and for the chronologically organized list of names to create a, quote, psychological space for veterans that directly focused on human response and feeling. The practice of listing the names of those killed in battle has ancient origins, but it was not adopted on a large scale in the modern world until the late 19th century. In the 20th, it became inescapable. Across Europe, memorials for those killed in the First World War featured engraved lists of names, most often paired with heroic statuary and classical architectural forms. Edwin Lutyens' Thiepval Memorial in northern France famously takes the form of a set of perpendicular triumphal arches, one standing atop the other, with nearly every inch of its stone-clad piers filled with over 72,000 engraved names of British and South African soldiers presumed to have been killed in the Battle of the Somme. Linn found herself particularly drawn to this memorial, recalling how the historian Vincent Scully, her professor at Yale, described the central archway as a gaping scream through which visitors had to pass. To walk past those names and realize those lost lives, the effect of that is the strength of the design, Linn wrote, suggesting that the memorial's acknowledgement of the lives lost, quote, without focusing on the war, became the basis for her own, quote, apolitical approach. Yet both Lutyens's and Linn's memorials are political, and in opposing ways. The stacked archways at Thiepval declare that the triumph of the state literally rests upon the sacrifice of thousands of soldiers. Mass death is redeemed through victory, through the survival and flourishing of the empire. It's no accident that among Lutyens' other notable works is the grandiose Viceroy's House, the seat of the British Raj in New Delhi. Linn's misreading of Lutyens is clever and productive. It enabled her to extract from Thiepval the idea of forcing visitors to reckon with the sheer scale of death, and to frame it as a precedent in support of her own very different political conviction that memorials should refuse to paper over the horrors of modern warfare. The leap from Thiepval to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, then, is a leap from justifying war to making visible its horrors, from redeeming death to marking it in silence. I did not want to civilize war by glorifying it, Linn wrote. The controversy that emerged following the announcement that Linn's design had won the anonymous competition revealed just how political the memorial had to be. Far-right figures decried the design as a, quote, black gash of shame, often attacking Linn in racist and sexist terms and accusing Scruggs and the Memorial Fund's other leaders of insulting veterans and fomenting anti-war sentiment. They objected to the memorial's color, to its below-grade sighting, lack of patriotic symbolism, and its stark abstraction. And they argued that its construction would undercut support for the Ronald Reagan administration's military interventions in Latin America. Linn and Scruggs, for their part, stuck to the line that the memorial's design took no position on the merits of the war and was solely dedicated to honoring veterans whose lives had been lost. Despite the well-funded efforts of the project's opponents to derail it, the largest veterans organizations remained supportive, and in early 1982, the Memorial Fund and its critics agreed on a compromise to add a statue and flag to Linn's austere composition. The realized memorial did not satisfy everyone. Linn took great pride in the design, but complained that the added statues, a second soon joined the first, were sad indicators that some politicians believe you can please all of the people all of the time. The memorial's sharpest critics remained unhappy that it refused to return to earlier modes of glorifying soldiers in battle. And some of us who see the memorial as critical of the Vietnam War, and of war more broadly, regret that it says nothing about the atrocities committed by the American military, or about the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians who otherwise died as a result of the war. Yet the extent to which this memorial touched a national nerve, the extent to which it was able to address a previously horrific history directly, and in a setting so central to the national imaginary, is remarkable. In The Things They Carried, the famed short story collection by Tim O'Brien, the veteran Norman Bowker spends hours driving in circles around a lake in his Iowa hometown, imagining the conversations he wants to have, the difficult memories he wants to share, with family and friends unwilling or unable to discuss the war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial's achievement is in speaking the dark truths that had so often rendered the war unspeakable in American life. The ultimate failure and futility, the vast number of deaths, the records and memories of atrocity, the entire nation's complicity. The memorial renders all this visible without casting aspersion on those who fought. Its lack of political sloganeering, which is not to say its lack of political content, allows it to acknowledge the terrible weight of politics without placing itself in a position of moral superiority. It is a place to grieve. And it has become such a place on account of its architectural form, on account of its simple materiality and geometric abstraction, and most of all on account of the distinctive spatial experience it engenders, the descent into an utterly other space, a space where one confronts oneself. Linn's design allowed the memorial to address the most painful of histories in a manner that is both principled and capable of reaching a vast and diverse audience of veterans and the broader United States public. Such architecture could be called autonomous, not in the usual sense, but rather in the sense that in making use of its own distinct disciplinary capability, what Louis Kahn called the thoughtful making of spaces, it is able to address the world on its own terms. That the memorial lacks discernible allusions or references to the history of the discipline in no way undercuts this. For Linn, the refusal to represent or ascribe meaning to the Vietnam War becomes equivalent to the refusal to civilize atrocity. The asceticism and total abstraction of her memorial, understood against a disciplinary history of triumphal memorials, becomes the most effective negative moral statement of all. If the pro-autonomy architects of the 1970s renounced the social agency of architecture through their refusal to represent the world outside the discipline, Linn showed it is possible for the very same refusal of representation to itself become a potent act of social critique. And suddenly the whole question of autonomy starts to dissolve, as Ludwig Wittgenstein famously suggested, of philosophical problems born of linguistic confusion. It is not that issues of disciplinary independence, of architecture's perceived political futility, and of the legitimate possibilities of representation become unimportant, but that the very framing of a choice between engagement and autonomy, so prevalent even today in architectural discourse, itself starts to look like part of the problem. In architecture, as in art, thinking around autonomy deserves to be historicized, to be placed in a particular moment, and to have its roots and causes analyzed and understood. Nonetheless, Linn's distinctly architectural protest against the horrors of the modern world serves as a potent reminder that such thinking does not need to remain in our present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izzy. If you can unshare your screen, please. And for keeping the time, it was wonderful. Quite an interesting presentation of the design that the way you presented at the same time seems to be unconcerned with autonomy, and also it does not renounce its autonomy, and abstraction plays a great role in that, instead of adopting symbolist ideas to present its content. So we'll have more time to talk about this at the end. Yes, Wilfried, please.
Well, I don't know whether we are within the schedule, and if
We
I
are.
read the program, there could be even 10 minutes, and if there are any questions, maybe we should allow for immediate questions to be addressed. I'm sorry that
we'll start
Xiang
at
Ren,
5 past. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, it's 11:10 is the official ending time, and we are ahead of schedule, right? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Everybody kept
Are there
their
any
times.
questions?
Yeah. Please, if you want to raise your hands or
I
write
think
them in
since we are on time, we can debate the for like quick questions, the first two presentations, and then by the end we can debate all four presentations.
Well, maybe I can add a couple of points. Having listened to you very carefully and having read your text, of course, there are certain issues about how the model is presented and how you use the word a cut in the ground, in the earth. There are parallels in the world of art, and the mere word cut is a clear metaphor, and the earth has always been Mother Earth. So there are some very basic terms that many people understand, where the language of architecture is not necessarily needed. So the pain with the the act of cutting is already a clear reference. What I think is remarkable is the fact that you only realize, I mean, unless you've read the description before you go there, but you only realize when you get there that all the names of the fallen are inscribed, and that, as you say, in relation to the sublime, is a moment of shock and horror. So these are some very basic morphological ways by which any design operates, whether it's architecture or whether it's sculpture or whatever, or art. And so these techniques, if you like, are clearly within the art form, and therefore autonomous to the art. Nevertheless, the metaphor is necessary in order to reinforce their power, their effect. So the rhetorical device of using these kinds of terms is an important reinforcement to the significance of these gestures.
I mean, I'm happy to respond.
May I?
Go,
and
go,
Fernando,
go.
maybe Fernando first. Yes, please.
No, I don't know if it has been mentioned, but I only now, thanks to Izzy, realize that one of the accomplishments of Maya Linn's design is to put all the names in a single surface, which is quite different from going around a building which has names in different faces. No? So this is, I just wanted to underline this realization. Thank you.
Please, Izzy.
Yeah, I thank you both for the comments. I think I completely agree with both of them. I mean, this paper for me came from the experience of spending time at the memorial, and also from memories of my first trip to Washington as a child. It was raining, and we went to the memorial as a class, and that was a very kind of distinctive kind of architectural experience that I will never forget. And part of that is the sheer scale of the names that comes from it being on these. It's basically a single kinked surface, as you say. And I think there is, to Wilfried's comments, I think there is more to be said in maybe a future draft of this about the metaphor of cutting, which is explicit in Linn's paper, but also just explicit in the architecture, and especially explicit in a piece of architecture like this that appears in the context of a mall that's defined by isolated monuments that rise out of the landscape, and this becomes the only one that goes down into it. So I think that metaphor is indeed an important way in which the memorial is able to be accessible, despite its sort of lack of like pedantry or didactic elements. At the same time, I think that, you know, Linn calls it a cut. I see it that way. The fact that it can be ambiguous, that it doesn't have to be seen that way, is valuable, right? I think there are many veterans who spend time there who don't see it in those terms. You know, certainly reading some of the literature about it that it is not from an architectural perspective, but about the kind of way the Vietnam War is remembered, right? That idea of it being a cut into the ground doesn't emerge there, except among the people who were kind of decrying it, and then the people who were defending the memorial were saying it's not that. So I think the ambiguity with that is also interesting. But thank you both.
If I may just say, continuation to what Izzy mentioned and Wilfried's comment, that indeed cutting, inscribing, or even going down can work as metaphors, but words are always ambiguous. So, you know, going down can be nest, can be something protective. So of course, it depends on how these things are being used. And I think with the next presentation, with Monica Graner's presentation, we'll see how a simple change in a building changes the whole context. So I think the discussion has reached an interesting point here. Maybe another comment I don't see. Yes, Jasna, please. If you unmute, we can't hear you, Jasna.
Thank you. But just a very short question about, could you tell us a little bit more about possible emotional side of experiencing this memorial, especially comparing to other, so let's say, ambiguous site-specific interventions from, let's say, Daniel Libeskind to more recent in Memorial to Holocaust in Vienna, opened a few years ago. So we always have not just documenting the what happened in the historical times, but also how do we, when we come to the site, how do we confront to this level of memory in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are questions that I've thought a lot about. I mean, I think, well, as to the emotional impact, I mean, I tried to get at that a little bit in what I wrote. I think it's a very intense place. I think it is distinctive in its scale, in its kind of radical difference from what's around it, and in the fact that you don't encounter any kind of narrative of the war apart from a flag and a statue, which I think are sort of suggestive of a certain narrative, and that's why they were a compromise. But even in relation, I mean, this memorial is obviously very famous and very influential with subsequent memorials. But what I've, there's a lot to be said about its relationship to Holocaust memorials, which also changed a lot beginning in the 1980s, right? Earlier ones tended to be much more literal or figural. So I think it's interesting to place it in dialogue with the Richard Serra, Peter Eisenman memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. I see that one as having a lot of affinities with this one, but the compromise in Berlin was to add the underground room that has a kind of narrative in it, right? That's supposed to make the memorial educational in some way. And part of what I actually value about the Linn memorial is that it doesn't take on that pedagogical role, which I think makes it much more uncomfortable for the observer, because it's much easier to go to memorial and feel like you're on the right side of things because you've learned the right lessons from history. And the Vietnam Memorial doesn't let you feel that way. It shows you thousands and thousands of people who died as part of the American political project in the context of the heart of the American government, and doesn't let you feel like, well, we've moved past it, we've learned from it, we wouldn't do something like that again, which obviously also isn't true. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how some of the thoughts I have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And then we do a 5-minute break.
I want to thank both Izzy and Xiang for their presentation. And I have a question for Xiang Ren, if he's in the room. I believe he is. I found very interesting all the symbols in your presentation and how it was interpreted in the project. I believe that's what autonomy and engagement is truly about, and how you explore that in your presentation. And can you talk more about like the social context and how it was interpreted like by the author of the project, the symbol, especially the mountain? I thought the project was so overwhelming, and it was like magical for me.
Thank you, Giovanna, for this. The social fabric of Shui community is gone. We could say that the spiritual side of the community, they're still there. That is consistent and held together by people such as Shui test master who can write and document their own indigenous record. So the spiritual part of that kind of consistency, continuity is there, but the physical part, the social fabric is disbanded because of rapid urbanization. That many of the indigenous families, they will need to send their next generations to the nearby towns and the cities. So there's a gap there, and I don't think the architecture designer of Westline Studio could engage further with the local Shui communities, let alone this specific site is far away from the Shui settlements. It is only being chosen by the power as a starting arrival zone for tourism department. So this is the complexity, and but something stabilized, something continuous, like their belief system, like their ritual celebration, their mountain worship, that is there. That constitutes a sort of autonomy. And the challenge for this building is, on one side, it needs to be a symbolic mark. So it needs to have that symbolic form to use ready-made materials and construction techniques, which is alienation of Shui vernacular. But on the other side, it needs to engage with that Shui internal autonomy in a more creative way. So since it is built there as a substance, it has the capacity to engage this indigenous group to the external world in the longer time. But without this physical form and structure there, the Shui community would be keeping their disbanding process socially and spiritually. So that's a dilemma. And on one side, the building has to engage with its user and their tacit knowledge. But on the other hand, the user group are not completed as before, and they've already been separated by the waves of urbanization and economy. And then in this sense, how architecture can step in and stand for a sort of autonomy to preserve that spirituality, that worship to the mountain, and to work together with the existing site-specific, and then trying to establish a public building for this indigenous group without any public building survived for now.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I answered, but there are layers of that. So
yeah, absolutely.
So I hope that makes sense.
Ruth, shall we continue or with the presentations or
Yeah,
the discussion?
the discussion is very interesting, but let's continue.
Okay, fine. So our next speaker is Monica Graner, who is an architect, an urban planner, and PhD student at the School of Architecture and Urbanism, University of Sao Paulo, with internship at the Sapienza University in Rome and the IAUV University in Venice. He's a researcher of the work of Giancarlo De Carlo and his school, the International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design, which he founded in 1976. Collaboration with the Fondazione Caro Manino in Urbino, experience in design and research involving education and university spaces. The subject of her presentation will be about Giancarlo De Carlo's Palazzo Ducale in Urbino, a civilizational narrative. Please, Monica, you have the keyboard.
Thank you. It's okay?
This is fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and very thank the committee for the opportunity. The title of my work is the Palazzo Ducale in Urbino, a narrative civilization. Giancarlo De Carlo interprets education as a human need to perfect and transmit the values and the results of our civilization. He worked for 50 years in Urbino, a historic city whose center of gravity is the Palazzo Ducale, an example of contextual architecture in which the principle of thinking globally and acting locally has prevailed over the centuries. From this perspective, the work aims to show the Palazzo Ducale as a narrative of civilization, to ponder dialectically autonomy and heteronomy in architecture, and its implication in contemporary discourse and in the formation of the architect urbanist for their commitment to social groups, heritage, and the environment. The reflections begin with the premises of Lefebvre and Tizones, who propose that autonomy in architecture is a cyclical and transient phenomenon, historically specific and intrinsically linked to how architecture is seen and socially used. But architecture differs from the other arts by having two souls, one practical and the other theoretical. Its fundamental purpose transcends the form, because it involves the transformation of the physical environment and an enhancement of the human condition, making it heteronymous. In this context, the Palazzo Ducale emerged as a paradigmatic example of the interdependence between its circumstances, history and its events, the expectation of social groups, the landscape, and the environment. De Carlo's methodological approach to safeguarding Urbino heritage and historical fabric is a world reference. The participatory focus provides citizens an excellent opportunity for acculturation, historical awareness, and appropriation of the physical space, which lasts until today. In 1998, Urbino was considered as UNESCO World Heritage Site for the architectural, technological, and landscape complex represents significant stage of humanity. Urbino is in central Italy, between the Apennines and the Adriatic Sea. Like many of the towns in the Marche region, it adheres perfectly to the hills on which it was founded, in harmony with the extraordinary landscape. Its historic center is articulated between the two elevations joined by a saddle, the lowest point between two hills. This small valley constitutes the topographical structure on which its urban fabric is based. Around 2 BC, the Romans set on the plateau of the hill, called Poggio, defined the Cardo-Decumano axis and the Roman Forum, where today is the Palazzo Ducale. They also implemented a theater and ingenious system of cisterns, whose ruins were discovered in the 20th century. Around 717, the Emperor Carlo Magno ceded Urbino to the church, experiencing a period of prosperity with emergence of small parishes. During the 11th and 12th centuries, Urbino grew according towards the second hill, creating northwest routes connecting two hills. The urban perimeter was enlarged with a new wall in perfect adherence to the topography, enveloping the parish nuclei and giving permeability for the fortified city, which was the basis for the development of the Renaissance city. Urbino achieved his splendor at the court of Federico III of Montefeltro, a military nobleman and humanist, educated in the most sophisticated and international of the Italian cities in the time, Venice. He brought to Urbino his refined way of life, perseverance, and tenacity to create a new cultural world. He used the fortune accumulated his victories to prosper his kingdom and subjects. Its famous library with 100 manuscripts from various parts of the world was open to citizens. For the Duke, all the arts represented a humanistic principle of collective prosperity. In the brief period of 40 years, Federico promoted a series of interventions in Urbino for the construction of his new residence, the Palazzo Ducale. The result was surprising and reflection the urban scale. The new architectural complex shifted the center of gravity of the historic city, changing the very orientation of Urbino. The turning point came with the reorientation of the palace's main facade, which had previously faced inward to the city. The new facade, housing the Duke's quarters, was turned outward, offering a view on the exceptional landscape and the papal see, Rome. A precise 25-degree rotation aligned the palazzo with the main road. This face was adorned with a vertical succession of balconies framed by two Torresini designed to display the Montefeltro court's flag. It became the symbol of Urbino's power and its humanism. Federico was certainly the mentor of successive transformation of the Palazzo Ducale. to carry out the work, he had the consultancy of Leon Battista Albert and hired the Dalmatian architect Luciano Laurana, who made the main body of the palace and the two Torricini. Later, he hired Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who built a bastion with a helical ramp, allowing the Duke to ride on horseback directly to the Palazzo. He built the stables for 300 horses and the Piazza del Mercatale, connected then to the Palazzo. An exceptional urban cohesion is the result of the efficient use of local, natural, and material resources. The site perfectly follows its morphology. Brick is used both in the palazzo and in the houses of the inhabitants, ensuring the social equality and the uniformity of the historic center. The Palazzo Ducale and the court of Frederick III inspired the famous book Il Cortegiano, a customs manual that taught how to become a courtier. The author, Baldassare Castiglione, wrote, Urbino, the seat in the shape of a palace. This is a view from the Palazzo Ducale towards the landscape and the Episcopal Center, Rome. In the mid-19th century, the urban structure of Urbino evolved under the influence of new technological and behavioral requirements. The opening of the new flat and passable roads to facilitate urban access to public transport, allowing the meeting and the ride of the carriage and the pedestrians. In front of the Palazzo Ducale, a new road was opened, and the Rafael Luzzenzio Theater was built on the top of helical ramp by Giorgio Martini. The theater obstructed and coiled the ramp until its rediscovery in the 20th century. In the 1947, Carlo Bo, an intellectual and professor, became rector of the Università di Urbino. Alongside Giancarlo De Carlo, they initiated a revitalization of Urbino Historic Center, with a university as the development core. Urbino became De Carlo's design laboratory, where he explored participatory architecture, reuse, and the city's genetic code, challenging mainstream Italian movements like formalism, tendenza, and postmodernism. De Carlo saw the Palazzo Ducale as the face of Urbino's architectural body, guiding what to preserve and transform. A significant moment occurred when a hidden cavity under the theater was discovered. It revealed the helical ramp of the Duke. This sparked a debate on whether to demolish or preserve the theater, as it blocked the view of the Palazzo. De Carlo advocated for this preservation, emphasizing that architectural growth, like a body, carries importance in every part. This was followed by a urban surgery called Operazione Mercatale, which involved the restoration of the theater, the helical ramp, the stables, and the construction of underground parking lot in Piazza del Mercatale by Giancarlo De Carlo. De Carlo's intention was to prevent vehicular access to the historic center through a new peripheral road system with parking of cars and buses and a new bus station, improving traffic flow and protecting the historic center. Finally, Palazzo Ducale shows the synergy between anthropic actions and the environment. His narrative shows the commitment of remarkable men and its inhabitants to build the structure of the city through their ways of life and an internal economy based on modesty and simplicity. This case study shows the heteronomy of architecture to confront the concept of autonomy, which is currently facing a crisis of formalism. The function of architecture is not to produce objects. Therefore, there is no autonomy of architecture. What exists is autonomy of certain architects, especially the archstars or star architects, who have become operative arms of the international market. The problem is that these archstars fascinate students and young architects and disconnects them from reality, the crisis of planetary urbanization in which we live. The future of architectures depends on professionals who are ethically and socially committed to the world we design. Not all architects who graduate from our schools will be archstars, so we should not cultivate and promote this culture as the only path to the excellence in architectural education. We must prioritize sustainability, social engagement, and heritage preservation, thus ensuring that the built environment is not only functional, but a legacy for the future generation. Not coincidentally, Giancarlo Ducale founded his school ELIAS in Urbino. His teachings constitute a fundamental deontological basis for the practice of architecture and urbanism, considering the ethical rigor and pragmatic humility that the profession requires. That's why it's important to revisit his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. We keep from your lecture at least this interesting point of no autonomy of architecture, but of autonomy of certain architects. We'll certainly talk about that at the end. Ruth, Wilfried, because Monica has finished earlier, do you want to carry on with a bit of discussion, or you prefer to have the last presentation and then we have a full discussion?
Maybe maybe the last one, and then we have more time to debate. I think not to cut too much the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wilfried, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. So our next speaker is David Caralt. David Caralt studied architecture in Barcelona and in Rome. He is currently an associate professor and researcher at the School of Architecture at the Universidad San Sebastián in Chile. His research focuses mainly on modern architecture transfer histories and on the nightscapes and urban nocturnes. His recent publications include the books An Accidental Masterpiece, Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, and the Barcelona Pavilion 100 Texts since 1929, both with Dietrich Neumann and published by Berghäuser in 2020. The edited book Emilio Derhard, Artículos, Conversaciones y Entrevistas on the Chilean Architect, is forthcoming this year. David Caralt's presentation will be about Arata Isozaki's CaixaForum in Barcelona, Spain. So please, David Caralt, you have the screen. You can share your...
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity also to the scientific committee. I will present the case of the new entrance for CaixaForum Barcelona by Arata Isozaki. Isozaki was an architect recognized as a versatile, influential, and truly international, and the first Japanese architect to forge a deep and long-lasting relationship between East and West, according to the jury of the Pritzker Prize. He created diverse and original oeuvre, including exhibitions and stage designs, publications, and collaborations with artists. However, he never adhered to a specific style. He was concerned to minimize the footprint and impact of his buildings, to preserve the beauty of the environment. His work reflects versatility of thinking and constant evolution over time. Despite his large-scale works, Isozaki always maintained an interest in small-scale projects, furniture, designs, and temporary exhibitions, in keeping with Japanese culture respect for small and delicate things. The new entrance to the CaixaForum in Barcelona is one of these small-scale, fine and discreet projects. It is framed in the renovation of the Casa Ramona factory, a spinning and weaving factory designed by Josep Puig i Cadafalch, one of the most important architects of Catalan modernism. The metal and brick building occupies the entire block of Mexico Street, here, Mexico Street, Jim Burnett Street, this one, Moravos Street, and the main avenue, Francesc Ferrer i Guàrdia, Towers, Montjuïc Mountain, and the Miss Pavilion. La Caixa Foundation began its project to transform it into a cultural center in 1997. The refurbishment project was led by Francisco Javier Asarta Ferraz, restoration, Roberto Luna, the adaptive reuse, and Robert Brufau, structural engineering. In order to house the new program, an underground floor was planned where the auditorium, technical rooms, and other facilities would be located. It was then that it was decided to change the main access to the factory from the original entrance on Mexico Street, like can be seen here, to an underground entrance through an English patio facing the side facade on the avenue. Clearly, access relocation to the main avenue was an intelligent and a strategic operation with the aim of reinforcing the cultural and architectural character of the new center due to the important and nearby Miss Pavilion presence. As early as October 1998, architect Roberto Luna had developed an idea for access to the new cultural center, which would be large and open air to allow natural light to enter the underground and a quick and safe evacuation. Luna had considered extending the lobby into a large courtyard accessible by escalators and a slightly glass cubic volume to mark the entrance. The new material glass was to contrast strongly with the roughness and warmth of the factory brick. Isozaki was a well-known name in Barcelona thanks to the Palau Sant Jordi construction in Montjuïc for the Olympic Games 1992. According to several sources, the direct commission to design the new entrance is due to the meeting between Isozaki and the general director of Fundació La Caixa at that time in Qatar, where the architect had carried out the extension of the National Museum. The Japanese architect was a perfect fit for the project. In addition to being an experienced international architect, he knew the city and in particular the site, Montjuïc. In this way, the project for the new cultural center of La Caixa gained in a media sense the design of an international prestigious architect, a logic followed later for the future CaixaForum centers. The relationship between architecture, culture, and politics was very present in the place. The mountain hosted the international exhibition in 1929, an initiative that sought to position Barcelona, at which time the German pavilion was built, and the initiative to rebuild Mies and Lily Reich building on the same site, finally completed in 1986, was in line with the city's internationalization. The pavilion had to coexist for a time and very close to the National Institute of Industry, INI, pavilion built in 1973, one of the last of Franco regime, a visually hard concrete building with circular forms on a single level and a basement, whose language came into tension with the pavilion. The INI building was finally demolished after the Olympic Games, so as not to interfere visually between the pavilion and the Magic Fountain. Isozaki was aware of this evolution of the site. He said, when I was planning the Palau Sant Jordi, I passed through the area around Montjuic hundreds of times, and I know it very well. The new access to CaixaForum has a surface area around 1,000 square meters and a double built area. Isozaki once described this project in this way. My proposal was for an underground gallery with a kind of sacred garden with a tree-like structure. The official description published in magazines tells the public patio, buried underground, is made up of Cordoba native limestone walls and floorboard, and comes with a small enclosed garden which partly caters to outdoor exhibition programs. From ground level, one approaches the underground main level by means of stairs, escalators, or elevators. The machinery is covered by the iron tree called tetsuhu, made of curtain steel and glass canopy. Isozaki kept the idea of the large atrium in front of the building and interpreted it in his own way. While the entrance connects with the heritage building by its function, the project also attends to surrounding elements. It is a space of mediation, on the one hand, between the different phases and ideas of the project, in whose rehabilitation final stage is inserted, and on the other hand, it is a space of mediation between the exterior and the interior of the building. According to Brufau, Isozaki commented that while observing the discrete style of Mies' construction, I thought that the best way to work had to be even more discrete. The historical weight of the Barcelona pavilion is unavoidable. The director of Isozaki's office in Spain, Mr. Toshiaki Tange, warns that Isozaki's design should not be described as inspired by the pavilion, but rather as respectful and considerate towards it. Now I wanted to put both works in relation in several aspects. In his essay on my method, Isozaki recognizes an important turning point in his design approach at the beginning of the 70s, when he began to take an interest in suprematism and the automatic generation of basic geometric forms. Contemporary projects to CaixaForum, such as the new Mariinsky Theater in Russia or the Beijing Book Building, are design speculation with specialized geometry. Both the pavilion and the new entrance can be understood as a geometric game of surfaces and planes displaced and fixed to arrange a certain composition. Both projects have a similar floor plan in terms of proportions and dimensions, around 1,000 square meters. The reading of the floor plan allows us to read the dominant horizontality of the projects. It is known that the origin of the pavilion's design is found in the build project of Mies Brick Country House, with its long walls that disappear into the landscape and configure sequences of spaces. In both this house and the pavilion, the corner and counters of the walls constitute a new grammar in accordance with the fluid space, while the normal corners enclose the spaces, as occurs in the Sacred Garden or in the pavilion water basins. In the new access, we find the Miesian language of walls that, so to speak, pass by. The stone materiality of the entrance to CaixaForum seems to resonate with that of the pavilion podium, not only because of the whitish tone, but also because of the grid's operational design. According to Mr. Tange, Isozaki asked him to find a light-colored natural stone in Spain. A limestone from Cordoba, the city of Cordoba, was used in, and Tange emphasizes that unlike travertine, natural stone ages and becomes more expressive over time. The floor plan of the entrance shows the 1-for-1 grid as a stone carpet that sinks into different platforms. This modulation, as in the pavilion, serves to determine the space's dimensions, such as the width of the stairs or the sacred garden area, for instance. Regarding the architecture of the pavilion, these are pictures of the original cantilever. Regarding the architecture of the pavilion, Iñaki Ábalos speaks of the recessed joint as an inversion of the molding. According to Ábalos, the horizontal shadow line linked to the stone materiality with which the inhabitant comes into direct contact enhances the experiential enjoyment of the space. In the new access, the detail of the meeting of the steps with the vertical surface is resolved with a recessed joint or shadow line that accompanies the entire design. The so-called sacred garden has been interpreted as the most Japanese space in the project. The area is enclosed by 5-meter-high walls, almost 4 meters below street level, only accessible from the corner of Moravos Street. The space was to serve as an open-air temporary exhibition hall, although the platforms at different levels converted the entire new entrance in a potential exhibition space. Official documents show that the space contains a thin sheet of water. The configuration of the space geometry materiality makes one think of the nearby pavilion's ponds. It is worth recalling that pavilion relationship with Japanese architecture, as the first in 1929 by the Swiss architect Hans Bernoulli, who referred to the pavilion as a kind of Japanese house, quiet and peaceful, with partially covered or open-air spaces on solid ground or water. The comparison with Japanese architecture was later taken up by Ludwig Glasser and Werner Blasser, and finally discarded by Hajime Yatsuka. As we mentioned earlier, Isozaki's design includes allusions to Japanese culture with names like Sacred Garden or Tetsuku, but the relationship with the East can be noted in the discreet and contemplative nature of the space, which seems to invite a silent spectator. Kolbe's sculpture Down is the only note of figurative language amidst the geometric purity of the pavilion's walls. It acts as a focal point to invite visitors to explore the space. At the street level, the Tetsuku tree sculpture serves as a signpost for the entrance, as pedestrians are only able to see the simple limestone parapet, barely a meter high, that extends across the entire facade. The Tetsuku is the only sculptural element in the project that contrasts with the walls and platforms' abstract language and acts as a focal point. Cannot be a coincidence that Isozaki's plan explaining the site shows, almost centrally, the pavilion floor plan without the roofs, that is, emphasizing the walls and the grid. This document allows us to see that the Tetsuku and escalator's inclination is exactly the same as that of the pavilion. They coincide. We said before that the new entrance is in keeping with the urban scale. It is a mediation between the factory and the pavilion. We could also remember that the design of the pavilion was very conscious of its location within the circuit of the 1929 exhibition, since it was in the middle of the route between the two most popular attractions then, the Magic Fountain and the Spanish Village. It was a place or building that was crossed like a shortcut. This parallelism allows us to see that both designs work with a great sense of place. In an essay on the virtues of modernity published shortly after the project, Isozaki said that much of my thought has to do with bringing the past and the present together. It seems that ideas continue to live even when we imagine that they are forgotten. By looking at the past, we learn not to imitate, but if we look more closely, we can see the ideas behind the structures, the ways in which they were conceived. That is the real lesson of the past and the way forward to the future. Ideas like the free promenade through space, the abstract language, a select materiality, or the sense of the place seem for Isozaki still alive and appropriate to solve the problem of the new access to the factory. This reminds us of what Arthur Drexler wrote in 1960. The pavilion is more than a unique masterpiece. It is the grammar of a complete style. It is a principle of order capable of generating other works of art. The new entrance is presented as an exemplary architectural synthesis, a small-scale open-air architecture, perhaps apparently simple, but capable of establishing a series of double dialogues. In Lehmann's terms, an ancient partner of Isozaki, it is a specific solution born out of the project's context, the reality of the site, and the building's program. Isozaki here assumes a narration of architectural history and theory based on synchronic structures rather than diachronic structures. Rather than a rupture or an inhibition, the past acts here as a stimulus for an innovative response. The new access to the CaixaForum is a design made under the presence of the pavilion, which reappears as a fertile echo, to use George Steiner's expression in his book Grammars of Creation. Thanks to the interpretation of the place and the intentionality of its details, this project brings together and conciliates. It seeks harmony and offers a peaceful coexistence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David, and for keeping the time. If you can unshare your presentation. Very interesting presentation about how the buildings reappear and recontextualizes the place itself and what follows. Let me just fix something on my screen to see all the viewers. So now we have completed. Shall I direct the discussion? Yeah.
Yeah.
First, I would like to thank all the speakers, and just as an introduction to the discussion that has already started previously twice, to say that next to the ideas of autonomy and engagement, which are the major issue of this conference, in today's session we have a word that accompanies them, and that is heritage. In the presentation of today's 4 papers, it is the reading of the context by the authors which forces us to juxtapose autonomy to engagement in different and novel ways. Very quickly, in the Shui Minority Cultural Center, context and culture relate to location and community. In the Vietnam Memorial by Linn, we have the creation of an entirely new context by her, addressing directly the content of the memorial. In the Palazzo Ducale in Urbino, one point in this palimpsest, as Monica mentioned, a formal transformation in the history allows us for the reinterpretation of the context with the same form. And finally, in the CaixaForum in Barcelona, the demolition and reconstruction of the pavilion, and not only that, and another demolition, and of the pavilion, not the original one, but the reconstructed one, creates a new context which impacts the future and new buildings after that. So one can think of the idea of buildings, Carlos has mentioned this one when he was in Athens, that buildings themselves are critical, buildings speak. So there is a conversation between buildings here, and we can see it, and I think it is one of the very positive attributes of these conferences, that we have this emphasis on specific buildings and how to talk about them. We have a solid basis. So let's open the discussion. I myself have a question for Xiang Ren, but I can leave it for the end if you like, or start with that to give a kick to the conversation. Shall I? I wanted to say.
Sengul
yes.
is raising the
I can
hand.
see all the hands. Of course, Sengul first. Sengul, please. If you unmute, Sengul, we can't hear you.
Well, I have a
question. You hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I think I've received a very good education on the autonomy of architecture, and the papers were very good. I congratulate the contributors. The conclusion I came to, I think I will hardly change. It is that the autonomy, the concept of autonomy, was corrected by Monica, and it was a very, very good concluding comment, to my mind, of course. What she said was that there is no autonomy of architecture, there is autonomy of architects. In addition to that, from the last presentation, I also deduced that we cannot even speak of the autonomy of a certain architect. Because here in the second presentation, Isozaki was the subject matter. And I'm not sure whether the building was very correctly chosen, but if he were the one to decide for every step, okay, the paper was well chosen. However, I don't think that he is autonomous in the sense that he always acts with the best of decisions and does the best of everything. As far I'm quite old, as you know. As far as I remember, Izosaki's museum on the lake was really autonomously built and was very beautiful. But when we were in Shanghai, we visited the Himalayas building, Himalayas Center. Some of us could remember it. And I think it was awful. Whether he was autonomous or not, I don't know, but the building did not really reflect the old Izozaki we knew of. So it is difficult to speak in terms of consistency in the personal history of architects. Only architects, I think, I would decide were highly autonomous was Turgut Cansever of Turkey and Wang Shu of China. They approach architecture as it should be in that specific environment and produce magnificent artifacts. They are autonomous and constant in their autonomy. So, while speaking about autonomy, I personally came to believe, after all these very successful presentations, that we should speak of autonomy of any architect in a very specific case and in a very specific sense. That's my conclusion. I drew this, and I thank all these contributors who helped me to come to a decision in this respect. Thank you very much. All the presentations I adored. I congratulate each one of them, and of course, especially my Monica.
Thank you, Sangul, for your clearly stated preferences in architecture and speakers. So who would like to comment next?
I do have
Comas.
Yeah.
Carlos, and then Wilfried.
Okay, this is for Izzy, and I did love your presentation. But I have a question, about how abstract really is violin design. In fact, the whole idea of having names on a wall is very much reminiscent for me of a kind of the ghost of a columbarium, a cemetery columbarium, and also the excavation, the cut, is also very much connected, with the idea of a burial. So I'd say that death is really very much present, in Maya Linn's work. And it might be that we do have, that we ought to revise the opposition we make between, between abstraction, figuration, autonomy, engagement. For instance, I found out looking into the dictionary that engagement is both, establishing the meaningful connection with someone or something, but it's also, getting into war with someone, So all those binaries, seem to distract our mind, from the complexities and contradictions in the real world and in architecture.
Yeah, I can respond quickly. Thanks very much for that comment. Yeah, I think I agree that abstraction here doesn't fully capture the kind of way that this memorial operates. I think the reason it feels important to me to keep abstraction as a component of it is, well, first of all, the kind of way in which this formal language is so different from what's around it, which is carries a certain set of connotations, the denotations for both architects and the public, and the kind of sheer blankness, the simplicity of the design, right? This was part of why it became so controversial with a public that thought memorials should look a certain way, should feel a certain way, should speak a certain way. That said, I mean, I think I agree with you that the kind of act of both the names and the act of kind of digging down, along with what WILFRIED mentioned before about the cut into the ground. I mean, these are ways of meaning that go beyond high abstraction, and they allow the memorial to sort of they are kind of essential to giving it its power, even if they remain ambiguous on a certain level. I think that's why in my paper I tried to link, rather than see the memorial in the context of the kind of architectural debates of the time, to link it to a kind of longer history of memorialization. And I chose the Tiepfal Memorial because it was important to Linn, but I think it could, equally be seen in relation to many other memorials of the 20th century and earlier. And those are also cases where the sort of idea of burial comes up and the lists of names and all of that. So I certainly agree with you that that those are there and they're kind of essential part of it.
Thank you.
Wilfried and then Fernando, did you raise your hand? Wilfried.
Thank you for the presentation on Isozaki and Mies. There are, I think, very important issues that you allude to. First of all, of course, the German pavilion by Mies is an abstraction of domestic architecture. And it's interesting that Fritz Neumeier and Wolfram Höpfner, who wrote a book many years ago on the geometry that underlines the design of the Wiegand House by Peter Behrens in Berlin. He shows, or they show, that the geometric ideas behind it are related to golden sections and so on. But more importantly, they show that the idea of the villa in the Wiegand House is overlapped with an idea of servant spaces. And there's a square element that contains the servants, and there's a C-shaped plan that is for the served. And if you follow the book of Neumeier and Höpfner, you will see that they mention a number of villas that Mies designed at the same time, or around that same time, where Mies begins to design buildings with a separate wall, a garden wall that becomes part of the architecture. I mention all this because it leads to the kind of neoplastic architecture that Mies ultimately expresses in the German pavilion. German pavilion is therefore a transformation of a Greek building into 20th century architecture. Okay, so if you look at the plan of the German pavilion with its 8 columns and has a central axis, that's part of the reminiscence of the house. Isozaki's building is a collage of neoplastic language, but with certain, shall we say, problems. If the Schröder house expresses a certain kind of a tectonic consistency between slabs, walls, pillars, etc., where things are of similar thickness, and the way that things are expressed and painted allude to this kind of equality of tectonic elements, then the problem with the Caixa project is that you have elements that are sometimes slabs, sometimes walls, but sometimes they are very deep elements. And so he mixes, in a way, a tectonic language that obscures the origin of neoplastic architecture. And so it becomes something else. But that something else is not something new on its own. It's not autonomous as yet, I would say. So there's a difference between a certain kind of reading of the German pavilion, and then there's a certain kind of reading of neoplastic architecture, and then there's a certain kind of interpretation of that into some project, into a concrete project. And I would say that each one of these is of a different stage and is of a different degree of autonomy or dependence. And I think one would benefit, or the paper could benefit from that kind of differentiation.
Wilfried, are you raising a question of integrity and consistency there for Isozaki?
Yeah, you could say that. I think that, how can one put it? The new National Gallery and the German Pavilion really are about an idea of what is a base and what is a roof, what is a floating roof and what is a solid base. And that's a different language to the kind of neoplastic architecture that the Dutch were doing. So it's about the solidity of something and something that is almost ephemeral. And Mies also owes his architectural language to people like Adolf Appia, who transformed the landscape, the naturalistic landscape, into geometric landscape. But he was about solidity, he was about ground, about earth. And everything else that, of course, 20th century, 21st century allows us to do is to deny the fact of earth, and we just go on deeper, higher, regardless of what is actually a datum. And I think Mies is about a datum. And neoplastic architecture is not about a datum. It's about abstraction. It's about autonomy. It's about floating in space.
May I?
Who wanted to speak?
May I?
Yes, Fernando, please.
Yes, following Wilfried's command, I see that conversation is moving from buildings to architects in some way. And in this case of Isozaki's work, I think it's a work of voids, which contrasts with the airy ambience of Mia's pavilion. So necessarily it would be a different kind of conversation. But what I was most interested about David Caralt's statements is that he suggested that there's a connection between this analysis and the fact that Isozaki is a very eclectic architect, so that that eclecticism allows him to move differently in different contexts, to engage in different ways. So in some way, it's the same thing that Sengul pointed, that, well, the Shanghai building is something completely different. So I found this interesting in this moving the conversation from buildings to architects.
It's perhaps because they carry for a long time their own identity, and if that breaks, then you get into questions like the one about Isozaki. But perhaps David would like to comment on these observations.
Oh, just thank you for this. Thank you for these observations. And well, at least to comment an anecdote when I talk with Toshiaki Tange, that was the director of the Isozaki's office in Spain, about this project. The first thing he told me was the Isozaki's project has nothing to, there are no relationships between Isozaki's project, between our project and the pavilion. Absolutely nothing. This was the first comment. It was an invention of the journalists. So I was a little bit in shock. I comment also with Fernando, and I agree, or I think that this eclectic attitude towards the project is what made him capable of acting in this way, in this particular case. And obviously, I think there are a lot of layers. I agree with Professor Wilfried, because behind the pavilion, I wanted to, I have no time, but to talk about Appia, because I think it was a key point, of course, more than perhaps the neoplastic architecture. Thank you very much for these comments.
I should read a comment by Xiang Ren. To follow Fernando Diaz, there is no autonomy of architects as a profession, but there is a degree of autonomy of buildings as built substance and a degree of engagement as social constructs. It seems Monica has done something to this conversation. Who would like to take the torch?
My speech is terrible, but the concept of autonomy is very broad. So I borrowed the thesis de Lefebvre et Tizones because the circumscript discipline, it's my point of view. And in the last years, many architects have adopted autonomy as the freedom and to produce beautiful and strangers objects, disregarding the place and the user. for me, the result has been generic cities. And this, on another hand, I am very happy that in this conference dedicated to autonomy engagement, Giancarlo De Carlo is represented by two words, is mine and another, the Beneducci. It's very significant as it an opportunity to transmit his thought. Is it? Excuse me, but this is, I think.
Thank you, Monica.
Okay.
About what
yes.
David, yes, about what David commented about the author, the person that worked with Isozaki. It reminded me of this Harold Bloom's book, The Anxiety of Influence. That when he says that the artists never acknowledge influences because it's a problem for them, for the creativity, or it's a problem for them because it challenges their creativity. And it's so, but of course it's there, and that's why critics are necessary in a way, because we can see beyond that frame of just the opinion of because the opinion of an architect when he does a work, it's just like that, it's an opinion too. It's not actually the truth or a lie, it's an opinion as every other opinion. But just a comment. Thank you.
Or you accept where you steal from, like Philip Johnson does. I think it's Mr. Rocha has put his hand up. Yes, please. If you can unmute. We cannot hear you yet.
Ricardo, you need to unmute.
You are okay now, it seems, if you speak. The sign has gone away.
No, it's not working. Ricardo Rocha?
It's working. We hear you.
Maybe it's an unstable connection.
Yeah, perhaps.
It's an unstable connection. Would you like to try? Hello? Would you like to try to re-enter?
Or would you like to type your question?
Yes. If you can hear us, either type your question or re-enter.
Maybe I can take this moment to recount another anecdote, if I may. Rem Koolhaas gave a lecture at the GSD many, many years ago, and at the end, students stood up and said, your Villa da Lava shows many parallels to Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. And he burst out in a furious reply saying, you haven't understood anything I've said. So that is one type of architect, a star architect. The other type of architect you will see in the presentation next week by Alvaro Caesar, who talks about the influences on his work. So that's a completely different personality. Ricardo, can we hear
Ricardo,
you?
yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Fantastic.
Okay. I'm having some problem with my computer. Well, anyway, I'm thinking about maybe autonomy. It's in this case, remember Bob Venturi and Denise Brown about this possibility to understand autonomy as a possibility to be autonomous to the language that fits better to one situation or one side of kind of this. Perhaps someone said something similar about Arata Izozaki. So it's interesting because this kind of eclecticism may turn possible to choose between a viable language. And well, I'm not I don't know if I'm being clear, but anyway, this it's different if you think about me with a kind of obsession with some possibilities of language, even if we compare the European period with the American period, but there's obvious all we know about the difference. But anyway, and with the first example, the first works, I was thinking about something Professor WILFRIED Wang said about the, and we can talk about not only about abstraction, but abstract forms, but archetypal forms. And this is interesting because there is something of boundary between abstract forms and archetypal forms. We think about the first project with this kind of archetypal with 3 triangles suggesting a mountain, and we at the same time this is a geometrical pattern. So there's a kind of discussion between this gray area between archetypal forms and abstract. Well, thank you.
Somebody would like to comment along those lines, or go to perhaps another question and come back, another comment? I would like to say something regarding Xiang Ren's presentation about the Shui Minority Cultural Center, if I may. It seems that to come, maybe to start the conversation again about engagement and autonomy, you actually call it in your abstract an uncomfortable zone. And in other papers, we have seen how there is this tug between them. Now, the context, i.e. the place of ethnic minorities, the specific one that you mentioned, provides us with possibilities for this bridging between autonomy and engagement in the case that we present. Do you think this is a unique situation, or would it be possible to also retrieve such archetypical forms within a contemporary urban situation? Is it something limited to such a specific case, or can we see it within cities, within a wider context? I asked last year Wang Shu the same question. His answer was very interesting on the same subject. So, if you...
Thank you very much. And it's, of course, it's privileged to know at the end that you ask Wang Shu the same question. That I think, first of all, yes, because we very rarely talk about new contemporary architecture in those past indigenous contexts. So I think it's specific because of the specificity of Shui, which I also mentioned. There are lots of other more destructive buildings in other ethnic minority areas of the same province. So I think this one particular highly unique and represent that agency of architecture or architects, which can mediate or which can have showing a degree of autonomy, but also a degree of engagement, which navigate into the interplay. So I said yes, but also in terms of your second layer of the question that make me think is I think there's a degree of transferability, because that relates to my just the chat box saying that I believe there's some sort of autonomy in buildings as a form of knowledge and as a disciplinary practice, rather than as a single product or signature from lone genius architects. Because I think buildings has some sort of autonomy, and then because of this, because of that form, because of this way to engage with mountain and engage with that tacit rituals to celebrate mountains and celebrate that ancestors in between mountains, taking mountains as walls, as roofs, with sky as like Louis Kahn. We can see lots of Louis Kahn in that project, by the way. But I think buildings do have some sort of autonomy, and I believe there's some transferability, that kind of scalability in this. So if I can respond to your this questioning, I hope as an architect and architecture service, I hope this kind of autonomy could be protected by us all, rather than expose it, because it's so fragile and it's easy to say architecture has no autonomy because architecture is highly restrained by external conditions, by economy, by power, by politics, of course. But then my argument is architecture is not the only product of architects. It is also with those indigenous people, their spiritual tacit world, their life world, which is not that explicit, but that could be translated, interpreted by architects like West Nine Studio. So in that sense, back to my message following Professor Diaz, and with very polite, subtle disagreement with Monica, that I understand that the idea on Giancarlo Ducale, of course, there's no autonomy of architecture because Giancarlo Ducale, that public nature, that participatory approach to ecology, the wider community, and reading the territories, that is the agency of that kind of engagement. And I can see it far moving into that engagement part for Giancarlo Ducale. But I would step back to look at this Aboriginal, original, authentic, indigenous context, that when there's really ground zero, about really like nothing there, when their current physical structures and settlements are not matching to their rich life worlds, can architecture, can building step into this context and provide and preserve some sort of autonomy without cutting off that engagement to further, to meanings, to representations?
Thank you. Monica could say something about that, but I just wanted to say it's quite clear what you're doing, the way you describe it now, but in your text and the presentation, quite a few times you make a contrast and you talk about fast changing societies. You use the word fast changing quite a few times, and you juxtapose it with the interest in ontological research, which you think is valid. So I think beyond the scope of your paper and what you described, to put forward the notion that in a fast-changing society, ontological research, archetypes are still valid and we should be concerned about them, I think it's a matter for wider concern. So that was the point why I asked you the question, but Wilfried wants to, has raised his hand, and whoever. Yes, please, Wilfried.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, being in Shanghai at the moment and having traveled a little bit, not very much, in the surroundings here, and having seen some other architects' work, the sense that I get is that, to come back to this notion of fast-changing context, China is one of the most rapidly modernizing countries that any part of the world has ever seen. I think you have to come here to understand the scale and the force and the effect that the changes have on people. So that's number one, and it's not just the minorities that are impacted, it's everybody who's impacted. So the notion that the key notion, I think that Western countries are dabbling with when we talk about autonomy and engagement, and the fragile plant of culture. If we use that kind of a notion, how do we maintain the kind of life of this fragile plant called culture? That is completely not relevant in China. To the extent that when the party decides modernization is the direction in which the country is going to go, it means modernization. It means getting rid of anything that is outdated, that is low standard, that is that smells of the past, of decay. That has to be removed because China wants to be a leading modern country. So this dilemma of uprooting, of cutting the roots of culture affects everybody. And I have the sense that, with all the good intentions that politicians might have, and local politicians and local governors and so on, when they see a Chinese or a kind of a logograph, an old symbol of a mountain, this kind of triangle, and you showed it in your, Xiang Ren showed it in his introductory slides, these three triangles. They said they would say in the competition or whatever in the presentation, oh yeah, that's what we are about. So they cling on to the minimal elements of culture in order to project that as the surviving part of culture. And that's the place where we are, not just in China, but in every part of the world, where politicians cling on to the minimum kind of ridiculous, superficial graphic logo in order to make some kind of logic out of a logo and to validate a choice. There is no such thing as discussion of materials, discussion of how the use actually accommodates certain rituals, blah blah blah. That's far too complicated. We have to make fast decisions, have to implement these projects quickly, and these things have to be done. That's the brutality of the situation.
Who else has a point to make? Yes, Xiang, please.
Sorry, yeah, just follow that. What Wang Shu responded to your question then?
I think, if I remember well, he talked about I can't remember the name of it, the very, very large landscaping and building of an area with elements of the land coming in. And there, his answer was that he had to convince clients to reconstruct, to recreate the whole context. That is the clearest memory I have of his answer. But it was impressive because I asked him the same thing, how can you do this in a town? And he said, in an urban context, it's difficult, but if you have to do it, and if you're thinking in this way, then you have to find the ways to recreate the whole context. You don't just do one building, one facade. You use maybe the idea of courtyards that you introduce, and in some way you try to recreate, even in a difficult situation, in a micro scale, to recreate a context. That's what I remember of his answer. But he found it provocative to think of this idea within an urban situation, a given, a typical contemporary city. How would you do it? That's why I asked you, because you carry a valid idea with your paper, and then one thinks, okay, what Xiang said is interesting. What do we do with it if we are not in these cases? We build in our cities, we design in our cities.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just
Mr. Rocha.
Yeah, I mean, so Amateur Architect Studio, led by Wang Shu and Lu Wenyu, from my perspective, is closest to the modus operandi and philosophically positioning of West Nine Studio. So I see the collection in your because it's not only about rural or urban or somewhere in between, like Wilfried saying, in that dramatic change in scales and in speed. But I think it's about the form. It is about the form of architecture to respond to this. So Wang Shu mentioned, you said, transform the context, you know, as
the degree that you can, yes.
Yeah, but West Nine Studio wouldn't be that powerful as Wang Shu, so they tend to work with the context and still keep the form there. So that really to my message earlier, that I feel that form is not just a style or vocabulary, but that form is something architecture needs to readdress and be confident that's some sort of our autonomy, producing the form, reading the form, and transferring the meaning of the form in multiple ways. So that's the engagement. That's the engagement. That's later. But we have the form as the center of our discourse, and I feel in that sense, Wang Shu and the West Nine Studio, they are very similar architecture practitioners for me. Although they share a lot with milestone pioneers like Giancarlo Ducale, you know. But in this specific moment, they are leading into two different directions. While Giancarlo Ducale moving more into that public, that reading the territory, that participation, and multiple authorships. And Wang Shu and the West Nine Studios, they are fighting with, like Wilfried Wang said, that they're fighting with a stronger external force, politically, socially, and economically, which that architecture is so easily being subsumed by them and so fragile to hold those attachment to the site and to the people. But they did it, which I really appreciate.
Thank you. Mr. Rocha, and then Mr. Graziano. We still can't hear you, Mr. Rocha.
Yes,
there you are. Okay.
Yes. Well, what Wilfried said about this problem, iconic forms, but we can remember Oscar Niemeyer. Well, I'm not going through this, but at the same time with my project of the memorial, we see this kind of architectural form being deeply emotive, or some kind of creating this kind of reactions of deeply emotive type. So we have complexity talk about the body and the Scott again. But anyway, we have this side, but then we have another side. Maybe an architect can use some kind of abstract or architectural form in a way that it creates this kind of deeply emotional reaction. So it's a kind of contradiction in modern or contemporary society. I don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Graziano.
Yeah, I would like to comment on Wilfried's comment also about this relation with power nowadays, right? This pessimistic state of art that Mr. Wilfried talked about. What I was thinking about is if this relation of engagement with power, with this idea that Professor Comas said of dispute, of war, isn't a constant in the architectural history. And I would use the example of the presentation that we began today of Professor Comas of the Salisbury extension, that we had a competition, and then the Prince Charles didn't agree with the solution and had, in some sense, a logo idea, right? I want a classical building. And in some sense, he did it in the Salisbury extension, also in Poundbury. And we could say the same thing about Mr. Trump, right? With the idea of building only classical public buildings. And Donald Trump has this agenda against modernism. In some sense, out of this power positions are quite simplistic, right? And maybe the problem is how we as architects try to mediate this heteronymous position with materiality and a good design that we are discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Rafael, I should read what Xiang Ren sent to Wilfried, to all of us, I suppose. Read the point of scalability, which was raised by Koolhaas, but as you exactly sense, the sheer scale and speed happening in contemporary China are very unique, which renders the basis of autonomy and engagement in, of, via architecture or building slightly different from let's say, Greco-Roman basis. Yes, maybe somebody would like to comment on that. I don't know. The Greco-Roman basis has been used as a model over the centuries in various ways, and you can find in China, elsewhere, many examples, whether they're distorted or not like Venturi's that we saw before and Scott Brown's. So, but I think that the question of scale, I myself think that is hugely important. And when I have not visited many places in the East, but I think the scale and the way we can intervene, especially as a body of critics, is very important. How do we talk about these things when the scale is stupendous? So, Wilfried, it was addressed to you. I don't know if somebody else wants to comment.
Let me make this remark or reply. Of course, you know, the whole exercise of what Seeker is about is to try and sharpen our own abilities to talk in comprehensible ways to each other and then to the public, and to educate, you know, ourselves as well as others, and therefore to improve the quality of architecture. That is the ultimate goal. That is clearly the case. And so we don't get into these reductive decisions of saying, this is a logo, or this is a character, which goes back to ancient Chinese, you know, logographs. And therefore, we take this as the basis for the diagram for the section, right? So to differentiate, to sharpen sensitivities, to increase knowledge, to make people aware, that those are all aspects of the things that we should be engaged with. And to talk about the Greco-Roman tradition, Elias, when you come here, you will see, and anybody who's been to China, you will notice that what are those symmetric buildings clad with red granite, that at the center, they have these big red discs with with some Chinese characters. They are late Stalinist, neoclassical office buildings that represent the state, the Chinese state. Even today, those are, you know, the Greco-Roman legacies which Chinese government happily takes on.
And on the symbolic level, they're throughout the world, you find them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, throughout China.
Those Greco-Roman traces really are by product of China's invasion by the Europeans in the 18th century, in the 19th century.
No. It's the Stalinist influence since the 50s, really.
Yeah, but anyway, those are dated. Even if you come back to more recent times, you know, those are not all China. Those the history of China goes much further back than that.
Yeah, but no, I mean, you are sensitive enough, Carlos, to understand the difference between Chinese classical architecture and Greco-Roman architecture, right? And when you come and see these examples, which are quite beautiful, of the 1950s Chinese Stalinist classical architecture, you will see the progenitors of all the subsequent official buildings. And, you know, you just have to travel around a little bit and then you'll see.
I should read again something sent by Xiang Ren, meanwhile Sengul and Ruth have sent thank you notes. Xiang Ren says that the notion of public building in China has lost for at least half a century, has been lost. I myself very much appreciate ways and efforts that Wang Shu and new ones like Westline Studio put into that rebuilding the autonomy of building and the agency of the architect. So there is a continuation of that discussion, and I do not know if who were the ones that talked. It was Carlos, Fernando, Wilfred started the conversation about the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery. That has been left in lingo. We still have 15 minutes, as Ruth says. If you like to make some comments or have more questions, please do. If there are no more, I think the last presentation by David ended early, so we have had our full hour of debate as we wanted. I have a feeling with this fourth conference that more and more very good material is being accumulated that comes out in the volumes, and I think it is paradigmatic of what we could do, of what we talked about earlier, Wilfred. I think the level is very high with the monitoring of the member of SICA and the work that the actual presenters and authors do to their work. And you've shown us what the next volume is going to be, and it's quite impressive. A comment from Fernando, only to tell, I missed it. Let me read it again. Only to tell Ren how the Westline project to remind me of Bonnet Chapel in Soca in Uruguay. So that's a reference, a useful reference.
I just want to say that if you are going to, if we are going to finish soon, to ask you all to be together again, to join us again tomorrow, and in the next sessions in the next weekend. I'm sure they will also be very interesting. So let me remind you that keep on, because it will be really interesting. I give you the floor again, Elias.
No, basically it should be up to Carlos and you who organized everything. Thank you, and Wilfred. So if you'd like to close, I have nothing more to say. Thank you very much for the whole organization.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I agree. I look forward to the next publication. Volume 3 is going to appear soon. That is the book on the conference of last year. Volume 2, which should have appeared before Volume 3, is going to appear afterwards. That's because one of the authors didn't finish his essay on time. So apologies to all those contributors of Volume 2. The editor is at fault. So, but it's not going to happen from now onwards because the editor is going to be on your back. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
day.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Pode parar a gravação, Giovana.